Imagine a single building that held more knowledge than every university in medieval Europe combined. A place where scholars translated the entire intellectual inheritance of Greece, Persia, India, and Rome into a single language. A place where algebra was born, where the stars were mapped with instruments that would not be surpassed for 500 years, where physicians wrote medical encyclopedias that trained doctors across 3 continents for 7 centuries. Now imagine that building and everything inside it destroyed in a single week. That building was real. It stood in Baghdad. It was called Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And in the year 1258, it was annihilated so completely that the Tigris River, according to multiple eyewitness accounts, ran black with the ink of countless thousands of manuscripts thrown into its waters. Some accounts say the river ran black for days, others say weeks. The precise duration does not matter. What matters is the colour, black, the colour of ink. The dissolved remains of knowledge that took 500 years to gather, the dissolved work of tens of thousands of scholars, physicians, mathematicians, poets, historians, and astronomers, all reduced to a dark stain on the surface of a river. The scale of what was lost in Baghdad is almost impossible to convey in modern terms. Conservative scholarly estimates suggest that the libraries of Baghdad, including the House of Wisdom and dozens of private collections, held somewhere between 400,000 and several million individual manuscripts at the time of the Mongol siege. To put that in perspective, the largest library in Europe at that time, the Library of the Sorbonne in Paris, held roughly 2,000 volumes. The entire country of England, a kingdom with centuries of history and a functioning church and government, possessed fewer books than a single wealthy household in Baghdad. The gap between the Islamic world's accumulated knowledge and Europe's was not a gap, it was a chasm. It was as if one civilization were living in an age of literacy and information, while the other was still struggling with the very concept of a permanent record. And when the Mongols breached the walls of Baghdad in February of 1258, that chasm did not close. It simply swallowed everything. We often speak about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria as the greatest intellectual catastrophe in human history. That event is famous. It is taught in schools. It appears in films and novels and popular documentaries. But there is a strong argument made by serious historians that the fall of Baghdad was worse, far worse. The Alexandrian library was already in decline for centuries before its final destruction. Its collection had been copied, dispersed, partially preserved through Roman and Byzantine channels. The damage was real, but it was also gradual, spread over 4 centuries of neglect and intermittent violence. Baghdad was different. Baghdad was the living, beating heart of the most advanced intellectual civilization on earth at the moment it was destroyed. It was not in decline, it was not hollowed out, it was not a fading echo of a former glory. It was murdered at the height of its power, in the full flower of its productivity, while its scholars were still writing, still teaching, still pushing the boundaries of human knowledge forward. Think about what those numbers mean in human terms. Each manuscript represented weeks or months or years of a scholar's life. Each page was written by hand, word by word, by someone who had spent decades mastering a field of knowledge. The House of Wisdom was not a warehouse of mass-produced texts. It was a repository of individual human achievement, shelf after shelf of unique documents that embodied the labour and the insight of the finest minds in the medieval world. And here is what makes the loss so uniquely devastating. We cannot fully measure it. We do not know and can never know exactly what was on those pages. We have fragments. We have references in surviving texts to works that no longer exist. We have titles without content, authors without books, discoveries without proofs. We know enough to know that what was lost was staggering, but we do not know enough to say precisely what we are missing. The void is too large to map. The darkness is too deep to illuminate. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand exactly what was inside the House of Wisdom, why its loss set human knowledge back by centuries, and why some of the things that were destroyed there have never been recovered. You are going to learn about specific books, specific discoveries, specific technologies that existed in Baghdad and then simply vanished from the earth. You are going to see how the destruction of a single city in the 13th century created holes in human understanding that we are still, 800 years later, trying to fill. And you are going to confront a question that has haunted historians for generations. How much of what we know today did we have to discover twice? Because the first discovery was drowned in a river. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. This is a story about what happens when the most knowledgeable civilization in the world is erased in 7 days. It is a story about what was written on those pages that turned the Tigris black. It is a story about memory, fragility, and the terrifying ease with which centuries of brilliance can be reduced to nothing. It is a story about the silence that follows the death of a library, a silence so deep and so permanent that we have not yet found its bottom. And it is a story that demands to be told, because the lessons it holds are as urgent today as they were on the day the Mongols rode through the gates of Baghdad. Now, let us begin. To understand what was lost in Baghdad, we first need to understand how knowledge has been preserved and destroyed throughout human history. Because the story of the House of Wisdom is not an isolated event. It is part of a much larger and much older pattern, a pattern that stretches back to the very first moment a human being tried to record a thought and keep it safe from time. The earliest known writing systems emerged in Mesopotamia, in the land that would one day become Iraq. The Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets more than 5,000 years ago, according to current archaeological evidence. Those clay tablets, once fired or dried, became remarkably durable. Tens of thousands of them have survived to the present day, buried in the ruins of ancient cities like Uruk, and Nineveh. We can still read them, we can still hold them. They endured because clay, unlike paper, unlike papyrus, unlike parchment, does not burn easily. It does not dissolve in water. It does not rot in humid air. In fact, fire, which destroys most other writing media, can actually strengthen a clay tablet by hardening it further. Some of the clay tablets in modern museums owe their survival to the very fires that destroyed the buildings in which they were stored. But clay tablets were heavy. They were difficult to transport. They were slow to produce. A single administrative record might require a tablet the size of a human hand, and a trained scribe could produce only a limited number in a day. A literary work, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, required multiple tablets, each one fragile enough to crack if dropped. The library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, one of the most famous ancient collections, held roughly 30,000 tablets. That sounds like an enormous number, but in terms of actual text content, 30,000 clay tablets contain roughly the same amount of written information as a few hundred modern printed books. The entire royal library of the most powerful empire in the ancient Near East, a collection that was the pride of a king who boasted of his literacy, could fit on a single shelf in a modern bookstore. This is the first lesson in the history of knowledge preservation. The physical medium determines how much can be stored, how far it can travel, and how long it can survive. Each medium involves trade-offs. Clay was durable but limited in capacity. Papyrus, developed in Egypt, was lighter and allowed longer texts, but it decayed in any climate that was not extremely dry. The great papyrus collections of ancient Egypt survived precisely because the Egyptian climate is so arid. Move those same scrolls to a humid environment, to Greece, to Rome, to northern Europe, and they would rot within decades or centuries. Parchment, made from animal skin, was stronger than papyrus and could survive in a wider range of climates, but it was extraordinarily expensive. A single large book written on parchment might require the skins of 200 or more sheep or goats. Knowledge, in the ancient world, had a physical cost that is difficult for modern minds to grasp. A library was not merely an intellectual investment. It was an investment in livestock, in labour, in the skilled craft of preparing skins and mixing inks. The Greeks understood their cost, and they responded with ambition. The great library at Alexandria, founded under the Ptolemaic dynasty in the 3rd century before the Common Era, was an attempt to gather all of human knowledge into one place. The Ptolemies, the Greek-speaking rulers of Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, understood that control of knowledge was a form of political power. They built a library, not merely for the love of learning, though that played a role, but Because they wanted Alexandria to be the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, scholars have debated the size of the Alexandrian collection for centuries, but estimates generally range from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. Each scroll contained a single work or a portion of a larger work. The library employed scribes whose sole job was to copy texts from visiting ships. Any vessel that entered the harbour of Alexandria was required by law to surrender its books for copying. The originals were sometimes kept, and the copies returned to the owners. This was not generosity, it was hunger. The Ptolemies understood that the nation with the most knowledge held a strategic advantage over its rivals. The library at Alexandria also housed one of the earliest known efforts at systematic bibliography. The scholar Callimachus compiled a catalogue called the Pneumatics, which attempted to list every significant work in the Greek language, organized by subject. The Pneumatics itself does not survive in complete form, but fragments and references allow us to reconstruct its approximate scope. It was, in effect, the first attempt to create a comprehensive index of human knowledge. The very idea that such an index was necessary tells us something about the volume of knowledge that had already been produced. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Greeks had written so much that no single person could read it all, and a system of organization was required simply to keep track of what existed. The loss of the Alexandrian library is often described as a single catastrophic event, but the historical record tells a more complicated story. The library suffered damage during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 before the Common Era, when a fire spread from the harbour to nearby warehouses that may have contained overflow collections. Whether the main library building was damaged in this fire is debated. The Roman writer Plutarch mentions the fire, but he may be referring to a warehouse of books destined for export rather than the library itself. The library was damaged again during conflicts in the 3rd century of the Common Era, particularly during the Roman Emperor Aurelian's campaign to retake Egypt from the Palmyrene queen Zenobia. The final destruction of its remnant, the Serapeum, a smaller collection housed in the Temple of Serapis, came in 391 of the Common Era when a Christian mob destroyed the temple complex on the orders of the bishop Theophilus. But by that point, much of the collection had already been dispersed, copied, or lost through centuries of neglect. The point is this: Alexandria did not die all at once, it faded. It was chipped away over 4 centuries of political upheaval, religious conflict, and administrative decay. And even in that slow decline, some of its contents survived because they had been copied and sent elsewhere. Works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Hippocrates, and Archimedes travelled through Roman hands, then Byzantine hands, and eventually reached the scholars of the Islamic world. The destruction of Alexandria was real and significant, but it was not total, it was not sudden, and it was not the end of the knowledge it contained, because that knowledge had already been partially distributed. This is an important distinction because it helps us understand why the destruction of Baghdad was, in many respects, a greater catastrophe. Baghdad was not chipped away over 4 centuries. It was destroyed in a single military campaign in a matter of weeks, and while some of its knowledge had been copied and sent to libraries in Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus, and Samarkand, the concentration of original works, unique manuscripts, and irreplaceable research in Baghdad was so enormous that no amount of prior copying could have preserved more than a fraction of it. This is where the story of the House of Wisdom truly begins. In the 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era, the rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates created something unprecedented in human history. A single linguistic and administrative zone stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of China in the east. Arabic became the shared language of scholarship across this vast territory, much as Latin functioned in medieval Europe, but over a far larger geographic area and with a far greater commitment to the active pursuit of knowledge. Within this zone, a cultural attitude emerged that treated the acquisition of knowledge as both a religious obligation and a political priority. Multiple traditions within Islam emphasized the pursuit of knowledge as a sacred duty. Sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, such as the instruction to seek knowledge even as far as China, circulated widely, and provided religious sanction for the enormous investment of resources that the translation and research programs required. The Umayyad dynasty, which preceded the Abbasids, had already begun the process of collecting and translating texts from conquered civilizations, but it was the Abbasid dynasty which took power in 750 of the Common Era and established its capital at Baghdad, that elevated this process to an institutional and imperial scale. The city of Baghdad itself was founded in 762 by the Caliph al-Mansur on the western bank of the Tigris River. It was designed from the beginning as a center of learning, administration, and commerce. The city was built in a circular plan, with the caliph's palace and a great mosque at its center, surrounded by concentric rings of government buildings, residences, and markets. One of the most consequential technological advantages that Baghdad possessed over its contemporaries was the adoption and refinement of paper-making. The technology of paper production had originated in China and reached the Islamic world through Central Asia, likely through contact with Chinese craftsmen captured or encountered during the Battle of Talas in 751. The Abbasids recognized the transformative potential of this material immediately. Paper was cheaper than parchment by an enormous margin. It was lighter and more flexible than papyrus. It could be produced in quantity from readily available materials, including linen rags, hemp, and plant fibers. By the late 8th century, paper mills were operating in Baghdad and in Samarkand, producing reams of high-quality writing material at a cost that would have seemed miraculous to a European monastic scribe laboriously preparing sheets of calfskin vellum. The impact of affordable paper on the intellectual culture of Baghdad cannot be overstated. Cheap paper meant that books could be copied quickly and sold at prices that a middle-class merchant or government clerk could afford. It meant that administrative records could be kept in far greater detail. It meant that scholarly debates could be conducted in writing, with treatises and counter-treatises circulating among scholars across the empire in a matter of weeks or months. Baghdad developed a thriving book trade, with entire streets and market districts devoted to booksellers, copyists, bookbinders, paper merchants, and calligraphers. The historian al-Yaqubi, writing in the 9th century, counted over 100 booksellers in a single district of the city. The bibliophile al-Nadim compiled his famous Fihrist, or catalogue, in 987, attempting to list every book written in Arabic up to that time. The Fihrist runs to hundreds of pages and lists thousands upon thousands of titles across every conceivable subject, from theology and jurisprudence to agriculture, music theory, alchemy, and the interpretation of dreams. It is a staggering document, a snapshot of a civilization that was producing and consuming written knowledge on a scale that dwarfed anything in the contemporary world. Baghdad also invested in physical infrastructure that supported its intellectual ambitions. The city's hospital system was among the most advanced in the medieval world. The Bimaristan, or public hospital, was a distinctly Islamic institutional innovation. These were not the crude hospices of medieval Europe, where patients were given spiritual comfort but little medical treatment. The Bimaristans of Baghdad were sophisticated medical institutions with separate wards for different conditions, resident physicians who conducted daily rounds, pharmacies stocked with hundreds of compounds, and training programs for medical students. The Adudi Hospital, founded in Baghdad in 982, had 24 physicians on staff and treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. It maintained detailed patient records and conducted something approaching what we would now call clinical research, with physicians comparing treatment outcomes across large numbers of cases. Baghdad grew with astonishing speed. Within a few decades of its founding, it had become the largest city in the world outside of China, with a population estimated at over 1 million people by the 9th century. To put that figure in context, London at the same time had a population of perhaps 10 to 15,000. Paris was slightly larger. The great cities of Europe were, by the standards of Baghdad, modest towns. Baghdad was a metropolis, a hub of international trade that connected the Mediterranean world with India, China, and Southeast Asia through overland caravan routes and maritime shipping lanes. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, was established during the reign of Harun al-Rashid around the late 8th century and expanded dramatically under his son, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who ruled from 813 to 833. Al-Ma'mun was, by any reasonable historical standard, one of the most intellectually ambitious rulers who ever lived. He did not merely tolerate scholarship, he did not merely fund it from a distance. He actively sought it out with the resources of an empire. He participated in scholarly debates. He corresponded with scholars. He treated the pursuit of knowledge as a matter of personal and imperial prestige. Al-Ma'mun sent delegations to the Byzantine Empire specifically to acquire Greek manuscripts. He funded expeditions to Persia, India, and Central Asia to collect texts in Sanskrit, Pahlavi, Syriac, and other languages. He established translation teams composed of the finest linguists in the Islamic world and paid them, according to some accounts, the weight of each completed translation in gold. This was not a metaphor. The translators were literally compensated by weighing their finished manuscripts against gold on a balance scale. The message was clear. Knowledge was valued as highly as the most precious metal on earth. The most famous of these translators was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian who spoke Arabic, Syriac, Greek, and Persian with equal fluency. Hunayn and his circle of students and colleagues translated an astonishing volume of Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. His methods were rigorous. He did not work from a single manuscript, but compared multiple copies of each Greek text to identify errors and corruptions. He developed a technical vocabulary in Arabic for philosophical and scientific concepts that had no prior Arabic equivalent. His translations were not word-for-word substitutions. They were careful, thoughtful renderings that attempted to capture the full meaning of the Greek originals in clear, precise Arabic prose. Modern scholars who have compared Hunayn's Arabic translations with surviving Greek originals have found them to be remarkably accurate. Hunayn translated nearly the entire surviving corpus of Galen, the foundational figure of Greek medicine, into Arabic. This was not a small task. Galen's works comprised dozens of individual treatises on subjects ranging from anatomy and physiology to pharmacology and diagnostic technique. The Arabic versions of Galen produced by Hunayn and his school became the foundation of medical education in the Islamic world for centuries, and, through later Latin translations, influenced European medicine for centuries more. But the translation movement was far wider than Galen. The scholars of the House of Wisdom and its associated institutions produced Arabic versions of virtually every significant Greek scientific and philosophical text that was available in the 9th and 10th centuries. This included the complete works of Aristotle on logic, physics, metaphysics, biology, and ethics. It included the mathematical works of Euclid, whose Elements became one of the most widely studied texts in the Islamic world. It included the astronomical work of Ptolemy, whose Almagest was translated into Arabic and became the starting point for centuries of Islamic astronomical research. It included the works of Archimedes on mechanics, hydrostatics, and mathematics. It included the mathematical treatise of Apollonius of Perga on conic sections, a work of extraordinary sophistication that was largely unknown in medieval Europe but was studied intensively in the Islamic world. The translation movement also reached far beyond Greek sources. Mathematical texts from India, including the decimal numeral system and early algebraic techniques, were translated from Sanskrit into Arabic. The numeral system that we now call Arabic numerals, the system of 10 digits including 0 that is the foundation of virtually all modern mathematics and computing, reached the Islamic world from India through this translation process, and was then transmitted to Europe through Arabic mathematical texts. Astronomical tables from Persia, based on centuries of Babylonian and Sasanian observational traditions, were translated and incorporated into the growing Arabic astronomical corpus. Agricultural manuals, veterinary texts, pharmacological handbooks, and philosophical treatises from every corner of the empire were collected, translated, and made available to the scholarly community in Baghdad. The sheer scale of this undertaking is difficult to overstate. No comparable translation project had been attempted since the establishment of the Alexandrian Library, and the Baghdad project was, in many respects, more systematic, more comprehensive, and more sustained than anything the Ptolemies had achieved. The translation movement lasted roughly 2 centuries, from the late 8th century to the late 10th century, and it transformed Arabic into the dominant language of international scientific communication, a position it would hold for approximately 500 years. But the House of Wisdom was never merely a translation bureau. That is a common misconception that diminishes its true significance. It was a research institution. The scholars who worked there did not simply translate Greek texts and file them away. They read them, questioned them, tested them, extended them, and in many cases surpassed them. The House of Wisdom was not a museum of Greek knowledge. It was a laboratory where Greek, Persian, Indian, and original Arabic ideas were combined, refined, and pushed beyond their previous limits. Consider mathematics. The Persian scholar Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, who worked at the House of Wisdom in the early 9th century, wrote a book titled Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, which can be roughly translated as the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. The word al-Jabr in that title is the origin of our English word algebra. Al-Khwarizmi did not merely collect existing mathematical knowledge. He synthesized Indian, Greek, and Babylonian mathematical traditions into a new systematic framework for solving equations. His methods for manipulating equations, for reducing complex problems to simpler forms, for finding unknown quantities through systematic procedures were genuinely original contributions to mathematics. His name, Latinized as algorithmi, is the source of our word algorithm. Two of the most fundamental concepts in modern mathematics and computer science trace their names directly to a single scholar working in a single building in 9th century Baghdad. Consider astronomy. The astronomers at the House of Wisdom and its associated observatories built instruments and conducted systematic observations of the stars and planets that corrected errors in the work of the great Greek astronomer Ptolemy. They measured the tilt of the Earth's axis with remarkable precision. They calculated the length of the solar year with a margin of error of less than 2 minutes. They designed and constructed astronomical instruments of extraordinary ingenuity, including armillary spheres, astrolabes of increasing sophistication, quadrants, and sextants whose accuracy would not be surpassed in Europe for centuries. The observatory at Shamsiyya in Baghdad, commissioned by Al-Ma'mun, was one of the first purpose-built astronomical research facilities in history. Unlike earlier astronomical observation, which was typically conducted by individual scholars from convenient rooftops or open fields, the Shamsiyya Observatory was a dedicated institution with permanent instruments, a staff of trained observers, and a systematic program of nightly observation that continued over years and decades. A second observatory was established at Mount Qassiyun, near Damascus, and the two facilities coordinated their observations to improve accuracy through comparison and cross-verification. This was collaborative, institutional science, organized and funded on a scale that would not be replicated in Europe until the construction of Tycho Brahe's observatory at Uraniborg in the 16th century, more than 700 years later. The astronomical tables produced by these observatories, known as Z-tables, were masterworks of precision. The Zij al-Sindhind, the Zij al-Mumtahan, and the later Zij of al-Battani set new standards for astronomical accuracy and were used, in translated or adapted form, by European astronomers for centuries. Al-Battani's measurements of the solar year and the precession of the equinoxes were cited by Copernicus himself in his revolutionary work De Revolutionibus. The debt that Renaissance European astronomy owed to the scholars of Baghdad is not a matter of speculation. It is documented in the footnotes and citations of the European astronomers themselves. They produced star catalogues that named hundreds of stars, many of which still carry their Arabic names today. Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Vega, Altair, Deneb, Fomalhaut. These are Arabic names given by the astronomers who mapped the heavens from Baghdad and from the observatories the House of Wisdom tradition inspired. Consider medicine. The physician Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, wrote over 200 works on medical subjects. He was among the first physicians in any culture to distinguish between smallpox and measles as separate diseases, based on careful clinical observation. He wrote pioneering works on pediatric medicine, on allergy, on the relationship between diet and health. His clinical case studies, based on decades of practice in the hospitals of Baghdad and Ray, represented a standard of empirical medical documentation that was not widely matched in Europe for centuries. Al-Razi's approach to medicine was revolutionary in its insistence on empirical evidence over inherited authority. He famously wrote that he had tested the prescriptions of Galen against his own clinical experience and found many of them wanting. This willingness to challenge the greatest authorities of the past, to subject received wisdom to the test of observation and experiment, was one of the defining characteristics of the intellectual culture that the House of Wisdom nurtured. The physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, produced what may be the single most influential medical text in human history. His Canon of Medicine, a comprehensive encyclopedia of medical knowledge running to over 1,000,000 words, organized and systematized the entire medical knowledge of the ancient and Islamic worlds into a single coherent framework. The canon classified diseases, described their symptoms, identified their causes, and prescribed treatments with a thoroughness and logical rigor that made it the standard medical textbook across the Islamic world and in European universities for over 500 years. It was still being taught in European medical schools as late as the 17th century, nearly 800 years after it was written. No other medical text in history has maintained its authority over such a vast span of time and across such a diversity of cultures. Consider optics. The scholar Ibn al-Haytham, known in Latin as Al-Hazan, wrote a 7-volume treatise on optics called Kitab al-Manazir that fundamentally transformed the scientific understanding of vision and light. Before Ibn al-Haytham, the dominant theory of vision, inherited from Euclid and Ptolemy, held that the eyes emitted rays that travelled to objects and allowed them to be seen. This was called the emission theory of vision, and it had been accepted for more than 1,000 years. Ibn al-Haytham demolished it. Through careful experimentation, including the use of dark rooms and controlled light sources, he demonstrated that the opposite was true. Light travelled from objects to the eye. Vision was a process of reception, not emission. He described the camera obscura, the darkened chamber with a small aperture that projects inverted images, and used it as a model for understanding how the eye works. He formulated early versions of the laws of refraction. He insisted that scientific claims must be tested through experiment, not merely argued through logic. Many historians of science consider Ibn al-Haytham one of the true founders of the modern scientific method, and his influence, transmitted through Latin translations of his work, can be traced directly into the optical research of Roger Bacon, Whittelow, and eventually Johannes Kepler. Consider chemistry. The scholar Jabir ibn Hayyan, who worked in the late 8th century under the patronage of the early Abbasid court, is often called the father of chemistry. His experimental approach to the study of materials and substances, including the development of laboratory techniques such as distillation, crystallization, evaporation, and sublimation, laid the groundwork for the transformation of alchemy into experimental science. He classified substances systematically. He described chemical reactions with a precision that was unprecedented. The English word gibberish is sometimes said to derive from the Latinized form of his name, Geber, because European scholars found his highly technical Arabic writings nearly incomprehensible. Whether or not this etymology is correct, it captures the degree to which Islamic chemical knowledge outstripped European understanding of the subject during this period. The gap in technical capability was not a matter of degree, it was a matter of centuries. All of this knowledge, all of these discoveries, all of these texts and traditions and debates and innovations were connected, directly or indirectly, to the intellectual ecosystem that the House of Wisdom created and sustained, and all of it was concentrated in a single geographic area. Baghdad was not merely the political capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, it was the intellectual capital of the world. For roughly 5 centuries, from the mid-8th century to the mid-13th century, More original scientific and philosophical work was produced in Arabic, and much of it in or near Baghdad, than in any other language on earth. The geography of this intellectual ecosystem is crucial to understanding the scale of the eventual catastrophe. Baghdad's scholarly institutions were not scattered randomly across the city. They were clustered in particular neighborhoods and districts, creating dense networks of institutions where scholars could move easily between libraries, observatories, hospitals, and teaching halls. The eastern bank of the Tigris was home to many of the most important madrasas and private libraries. The Nizamiya, a great madrasa founded in 1067 by the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk, was one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the Islamic world, with a library that scholars travelled thousands of miles to consult. The Western Bank housed additional collections, including those associated with the Caliphal Palace complex. Mosques throughout the city maintained their own libraries, many of them substantial. The entire city was, in effect, a single vast repository of knowledge, the largest the world had ever seen, linked together by the daily movements of scholars, students, copyists, and booksellers through the streets and markets of Baghdad. There is a tendency, in modern popular culture, to imagine medieval civilization as uniformly dark, superstitious, and ignorant. That image is false in general, but it is spectacularly false when applied to the medieval Islamic world. The contrast between the two civilizations is stark and sobering. At a time when the largest library in Christian Europe might contain a few hundred volumes, the libraries of Baghdad contained hundreds of thousands. At a time when European monks were laboriously copying a handful of Greek texts they barely understood, the scholars of Baghdad were writing original works that advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, optics, chemistry, and philosophy far beyond anything the Greeks had achieved. The distance between the two civilizations, in terms of their intellectual output and institutional capacity, was enormous. This is the civilization that stood on the banks of the Tigris in the winter 1258. This is what the Mongols found when they arrived at the gates of the greatest city in the world. And what happened next was not a gradual decline. It was not a slow erosion over centuries. It was the most concentrated act of intellectual destruction in recorded history. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how knowledge survives. We assume that important things are preserved. We assume that if something is valuable enough, significant enough, useful enough, someone will save it. We assume that civilization has a self-correcting mechanism that protects its most important achievements. Baghdad proved that assumption catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. But what scientists and historians discovered in the centuries after was worse than anyone expected. The full scope of the loss only became clear gradually, as scholars began to catalogue what survived and, more painfully, what did not. The Mongol Empire, in the middle of the 13th century, was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols had conquered an area stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Their military machine was, by the standards of the age, the most efficient instrument of destruction that had ever been assembled. It was fast, it was disciplined, it was adaptive, and it was merciless to those who resisted. The key to Mongol military success was not mere brutality, though brutality played a role. It was organization. The Mongol army was structured in decimal units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Communication between units relied on a system of riders and signal flags that allowed commanders to coordinate movements across enormous distances. The Mongols were masters of cavalry warfare, capable of covering 60 or more miles in a single day, a rate of advance that most medieval armies could not match even on forced march. They carried their own supplies, including dried meat and fermented mare's milk, which reduced their dependence on supply lines and allowed them to operate far from their bases. And they had adopted siege warfare techniques from the civilizations they conquered, particularly from China, where siege technology was the most advanced in the world. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but the Mongol military machine continued to expand. The campaign against the Islamic heartland was entrusted to Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and the brother of the great Khan Monka. Hulagu had been specifically tasked with three objectives: the destruction of the Ismaili assassins in their mountain fortresses, the subjugation of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the conquest of Syria and Egypt. He assembled an army that contemporary sources estimate at between 120,000 and 300,000 soldiers, though modern historians generally consider the lower end of this range more reliable. Even the conservative estimate represents one of the largest military forces assembled in the medieval period. The Mongol advance toward Baghdad did not begin in a vacuum. The earlier Mongol campaigns under Genghis Khan and his successors had already devastated several of the Islamic world's great intellectual centers. The city of Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, had been one of the largest cities in the world in the early 13th century, with libraries, observatories, and scholars who contributed to the broader tradition of Islamic learning. In 1221, the Mongols sacked Merv with horrifying thoroughness. The Persian historian Juvaini, who later served the Mongol administration, reported that the dead at Merv numbered over 1 million, though modern historians regard this figure as exaggerated. Whatever the precise death toll, the destruction of Merv eliminated a major node in the Islamic scholarly network. The city of Nishapur, another important center of learning and home to significant manuscript collections, was destroyed by the Mongols in 1221 as well. The city of Bukhara, famous for its madrasas and libraries and its role as a center of Islamic jurisprudence and scholarship, was sacked in 1220. Samarkand fell the same year. In each case, the destruction included not only human life and physical infrastructure, but also the manuscript collections, scholarly communities, and educational institutions that those cities maintained. By the time Hulagu's army approached Baghdad in 1257, the Mongols had already destroyed or severely damaged nearly every major intellectual center in the Eastern Islamic world. Baghdad was not the first catastrophe. It was the culmination of a pattern of destruction that had been unfolding for more than 3 decades across thousands of miles. The cumulative effect of these earlier destructions made the fall of Baghdad even more consequential. Copies of manuscripts that might once have existed in Merv, Nishapur, Bukhara, and Samarkand had already been destroyed. Baghdad's collections, which had always been the most comprehensive, now held an even higher proportion of the remaining copies of important texts. The redundancy that might have protected the Islamic intellectual tradition, the distribution of copies across multiple cities, had been systematically reduced by the Mongol advance. By 1258, Baghdad's libraries may have contained the last surviving copies of thousands of works, whose duplicates in other Eastern Islamic cities had already been destroyed. Hulagu's army was not purely Mongol. It included contingents from every civilization the Mongols had conquered. There were Turkish cavalry, Persian infantry, Armenian Christian soldiers, and Chinese siege engineers who brought with them the most advanced siege technology in the world. This included catapults capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds, naphtha-based incendiary weapons that could set fire to fortifications from a distance, and techniques for diverting rivers to flood defenders or cut off water supplies. The army was, in effect, a military encyclopedia, a collection of the most effective combat techniques from every major civilization in Eurasia. Baghdad, by 1258, was no longer the invincible city it had been at its peak. The Abbasid Caliphate had been in political decline for centuries. Beginning in the 10th century, the caliphs had progressively lost effective military and administrative power to Turkish and Persian military commanders who ruled in their name. The kefs had become largely symbolic figures, religious authorities without real political control. They presided over a diminished realm, a shadow of the vast empire their ancestors had governed. Their military forces were small, poorly equipped, and poorly led. The last Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim was by most historical accounts an indecisive and poorly advised ruler. He was surrounded by courtiers and advisors who gave him conflicting counsel. Some urged him to negotiate with Hulagu, others urged him to resist. Some even suggested that the Mongol threat was exaggerated and that Baghdad's defences, though weakened, would hold. Al-Mustasim failed to prepare adequate fortifications. He failed to stockpile sufficient food and water for a siege. He failed to secure alliances with neighboring powers who might have come to his aid. He alienated the Shia Muslim communities within his own territories, who might have fought alongside him against the Mongol invasion. And he allowed his military forces to deteriorate to the point where the garrison of Baghdad, a city of hundreds of thousands of people, numbered only a fraction of the force needed to defend its walls. Hulagu sent envoys to al-Mustasim demanding his surrender. The Caliph refused, reportedly in terms that were insulting. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Mongol military doctrine, established by Genghis Khan himself, was clear and well known. Cities that surrendered without resistance were spared. Cities that resisted and were conquered were destroyed. The policy was not merely punitive, it was strategic. By making the consequences of resistance horrifyingly visible, the Mongols encouraged future cities to surrender without a fight, saving themselves the cost and risk of siege warfare. Al-Mustasim either did not understand this doctrine or believed that Baghdad was too important to be destroyed. He was wrong on the second count. When Hulagu's army arrived at the walls of Baghdad in January of 1258, the city's defences crumbled with shocking speed. The Mongols approached from multiple directions, surrounding the city and cutting off any possibility of escape or relief. The eastern walls were breached within days. The Baghdad garrison attempted a sortie, sending a force of cavalry out through the gates to attack the Mongol siege lines. This might have succeeded against a less sophisticated enemy, but the Mongols, using their knowledge of hydraulic engineering acquired from Chinese engineers and from their campaigns in the irrigation-dependent regions of Central Asia, breached dikes along the Tigris and flooded the ground behind the retreating defenders. The Baghdad cavalry, attempting to return to the safety of the city walls, found themselves trapped in a sea of mud and rising water. Thousands drowned. Thousands more were cut down by Mongol archers as they struggled in the mire. The sortie was destroyed, and with it went a significant portion of Baghdad's remaining military strength. On February 10th of 1258, according to the most commonly cited sources, the Caliph al-Mustasim emerged from the city and surrendered to Hulagu. The last ruler of the once mighty Abbasid Caliphate walked through the gates of a city that was already burning to deliver himself into the hands of a commander who had already decided the city's fate. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but they agree in their broad outlines. Hulagu received the Caliph, treated him with initial courtesy, and then ordered the systematic sack of the city. The Mongol army was given permission to loot, burn, and kill for a period that lasted, depending on the source, between 7 and 40 days. The death toll is disputed but staggering by any estimate. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who worked for the Mongol Ilkhanate court and had access to Mongol administrative records, estimated the dead at more than 800,000. Other contemporary Muslim historians gave figures ranging from 200,000 to 2 million. Modern historians generally suggest figures between 200,000 and 1 million, acknowledging that precision is impossible given the destruction of Baghdad's own administrative records. What is beyond dispute is that the vast majority of Baghdad's population was either killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. The city, which had been the largest and most prosperous in the Islamic world, was reduced to a depopulated ruin. The physical destruction extended far beyond the city walls. Baghdad's prosperity had always depended on an elaborate system of irrigation canals that channeled the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates across the fertile plains of central Iraq. This canal system, maintained and improved over centuries by successive governments, transformed the arid landscape into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. The canals supplied water to farms, orchards, and gardens that fed Baghdad's enormous population. They also powered mills, supplied bathhouses, and connected outlying towns and estates to the capital through a network of navigable waterways. The Mongol invasion destroyed this irrigation infrastructure. Canals were breached during the siege. The engineers and administrators who maintained the system were killed or scattered. In the years and decades after the sack, the canals silted up, collapsed, and were reclaimed by the desert. The agricultural hinterland that had sustained Baghdad for 5 centuries reverted to arid wasteland. The population collapse was therefore not merely the result of massacre. It was the result of a systemic destruction of the economic and agricultural foundations that made a great city possible. Even if the Mongols had spared every book and every scholar, the destruction of the canal system alone would have crippled Baghdad's ability to sustain a major intellectual culture for generations. The environmental devastation compounded the cultural losses in ways that historians are still working to fully understand. A great intellectual tradition requires more than libraries and scholars. It requires a functioning economy to fund research, a thriving population to produce new students and scholars, a network of trade routes to circulate ideas and manuscripts, and a stable political order to maintain institutions over the decades and centuries needed for sustained intellectual progress. The Mongol destruction eliminated all of these supporting conditions simultaneously. It was not merely an attack on knowledge. It was the destruction of the entire ecosystem that produced, sustained, and transmitted knowledge. The caliph himself was killed. The method of his execution is the subject of one of the most widely repeated stories from the siege. According to multiple sources, Hulagu had al-Mustasim rolled up in a carpet or blanket and trampled to death by horses. The Mongols believed that royal blood should not be shed by a blade, and this method of execution was considered a mark of respect, albeit a grim one. The death of al-Mustasim ended the Abbasid Caliphate, an institution that had existed for over 5 centuries, and that represented, for much of the Sunni Muslim world, the legitimate political and religious authority of Islam. Its destruction was not merely a military defeat, it was the end of an era. The killing extended to the scholarly class. The Mongol sack of Baghdad did not distinguish between soldiers and civilians, between political figures and private citizens. Physicians, astronomers, mathematicians, jurists, theologians, poets, historians, copyists, and booksellers were killed alongside soldiers and administrators. The precise number of scholars who died in the sack cannot be determined, but the impact on the Islamic intellectual community was devastating. These were not merely practitioners who could be replaced by training new ones. They were carriers of accumulated expertise, holders of knowledge that had been transmitted through personal relationships over decades. A physician who had spent 30 years refining a diagnostic technique, a mathematician who had developed new proofs that he had shared only with his closest students, an astronomer who had calibrated his instruments through years of nightly observation and had not yet written up his final results. When these people were killed, their unpublished knowledge died with them. The manuscripts in the libraries represented the written portion of Baghdad's intellectual tradition, but a significant portion of any scholarly tradition exists in unwritten form, in the minds and practices of living scholars, and that portion was destroyed as completely as the books. But the destruction of human life, as horrifying as it was, is not the subject of this account. The subject is what happened to the knowledge. Multiple sources, writing from different perspectives, and in different decades, describe what the Mongols did to the libraries of Baghdad. The books were thrown into the Tigris. This is not a metaphor. This is not a poetic exaggeration. This is not a legend invented by later generations to dramatize the fall of the city. This is a specific, attested, historical event reported by eyewitnesses and near-contemporary chroniclers, writing within decades of the event. The historian Ibn Kathir, writing in the 14th century, but drawing on earlier sources, recorded that the Mongols cast so many books into the river that a horseman could cross from one bank to the other on a bridge of manuscripts. The river's water turned black from the dissolved ink. Another chronicler reported that the river ran in 3 colours in different channels: red from the blood of the slain, black from the ink of the books, and brown from the ash of the burned buildings. The House of Wisdom itself was destroyed. The details of its physical destruction are not precisely recorded because the chroniclers were preoccupied with the larger catastrophe of the city's fall, but it is clear from every subsequent reference that the institution ceased to exist after 1258. Its building was either demolished, burned, or left as a ruin that later collapsed. Its contents, the product of 5 centuries of systematic collection, translation, and original research, were scattered, drowned, or consumed by fire. And it gets worse. The House of Wisdom was only the most famous library in Baghdad. It was not the only one. The city contained dozens of other significant collections. Private libraries belonging to wealthy families were a major feature of upper-class Baghdad culture. A prosperous merchant or government official might own thousands of volumes. The historian Al-Nadim, writing in the late 10th century, compiled a catalogue of Arabic literature called the Fihrist that listed thousands of authors and tens of thousands of works. His catalogue provides a window into the staggering richness of the Arabic literary and scientific tradition, and, by implication, into the size of the collections that supported it. Scholarly libraries were attached to mosques, to madrasas, to hospitals, and to observatories throughout the city. Specialized collections focused on particular subjects, such as law, theology, astronomy, or medicine. The historian Al-Kifti listed multiple major institutional collections in Baghdad, each containing thousands of volumes. All of these were destroyed together. The Mongols did not distinguish between the House of Wisdom and a private home library. They did not separate scientific manuscripts from administrative records or literary works from accounting ledgers. Everything was thrown into the river or burned. The destruction was comprehensive and indiscriminate. The aftermath left survivors in a state of intellectual vertigo. Scholars who had fled Baghdad in the final days before the siege, or who had been travelling elsewhere when the city fell, found themselves cut off from the libraries and colleagues that had defined their working lives. A mathematician who had relied on access to Baghdad's collections for his research suddenly found himself without references, without the texts of earlier scholars on which his own work was built, without the network of correspondents and collaborators who had sharpened his thinking and corrected his errors. The scholarly diaspora that followed the fall of Baghdad scattered the surviving fragments of the tradition across the Islamic world, from Cairo to Delhi, from Damascus to Samarkand. But a scattered tradition is a weakened tradition. Each refugee scholar carried only what he could remember and what he could physically transport. Personal libraries were heavy. Manuscripts were bulky. A scholar fleeing a besieged city on horseback might save a handful of his most prized volumes, but he could not carry the comprehensive reference collections that serious research required. The fragments that survived were scattered, decontextualized, and separated from the broader collections that had given them their full meaning and utility. The scholar Yaqut al-Hamawi, a geographer and biographer who had visited Baghdad shortly before the Mongol invasion, described a city rich with bookshops, copyists, and paper merchants. He noted that Baghdad's book market was one of the largest and most active in the world, with shops that specialized in particular subjects or types of manuscript. The demand for books was so great that professional copyists worked full-time producing manuscript copies for sale. This literary culture was supported by Baghdad's thriving paper industry. The technology of papermaking had traveled from China to the Islamic world in the 8th century, reportedly after Chinese papermakers were captured at the Battle of Talas in 751. Baghdad had become one of the major centers of paper production in the world, producing high-quality paper from cotton, linen, and other plant fibers. This paper industry made books far cheaper and more abundant than they had been in the age of parchment. A city that manufactured its own paper could produce books at a rate that a parchment-dependent culture could never match. This is one reason why Baghdad's libraries grew so large, but it also meant that when the libraries were destroyed, there were far more volumes to lose. The same paper industry that had enabled the accumulation of vast collections had also ensured that those collections were written on a medium that was highly vulnerable to water. Parchment, made from animal skin, resists water to some degree. It can be dried out and partially restored. Paper, especially the relatively thin paper used in medieval Arabic manuscripts, dissolves readily in water. The manuscripts thrown into the Tigris were not merely damaged, they were destroyed at the molecular level. The cellulose fibers that made up the paper absorbed water and disintegrated. The carbon-based inks dispersed into the current. Within hours, perhaps within minutes, the physical objects that carried 5 centuries of accumulated knowledge ceased to exist as readable documents. What specific works were destroyed? This is the question that torments historians, because we can only partially answer it. We know what was lost by looking at references in surviving texts. Medieval Islamic scholars frequently cited each other's works. A treatise on astronomy might reference 14 earlier studies. A medical text might quote from 20 previous authorities. A philosophical commentary might engage with dozens of earlier arguments. When those referenced works cannot be found in any surviving manuscript collection anywhere in the world, in any library, in any archive, in any private collection, the reasonable conclusion is that they were destroyed, and that the copies that might once have existed in Baghdad were among the last. The losses in mathematics alone are devastating to consider. Al-Khwarizmi's foundational works on algebra survived, in part because copies had already spread throughout the Islamic world and into Europe through the translation schools of Toledo and Sicily before 1258. But later mathematicians who built upon his work, whose original treatises were held primarily in Baghdad, were not so fortunate. Many of their works exist today only as titles in bibliographies, or as brief quotations embedded in the works of later authors who had read them. We know the titles. We sometimes know the subject matter. We do not know the content. The mathematician and astronomer Al-Battani made measurements of the solar year and the precession of the equinoxes so precise that they were not significantly improved upon for centuries. He wrote extensively on trigonometry, including tables of trigonometric functions that were essential tools for both astronomers and navigators. His complete works survive only in fragmentary form. How much of his work is gone? We do not know precisely. We know only that what survives is incomplete, and that the gaps correspond to texts that were probably held in the libraries where most Arabic scientific manuscripts were concentrated. The losses in medicine are equally severe. Al-Razi, who was discussed earlier, is credited with having written over 200 books and treatises. Fewer than half survive in any form. The rest are known only from references in other authors' works or from fragmentary quotations. Al-Razi's clinical case studies, his detailed records of patients treated, symptoms observed, and outcomes documented, were among the most valuable medical texts in the medieval world. Much of this clinical data is gone. The patients are long dead. The observations can never be repeated. The knowledge that those records contained about the course and treatment of diseases in a major medieval city has been permanently erased. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, fared somewhat better because his most famous work, the Canon of Medicine, had been so widely copied and translated that it survived in numerous manuscripts across the Islamic world and in Europe. But Ibn Sina wrote far more than the Canon. He produced philosophical works, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, and literary compositions that were less widely copied and are, in many cases, partially or wholly lost. Even in the case of the Canon itself, it is possible that the Baghdad manuscripts contained variant readings, marginal annotations, or supplementary materials that were not present in copies held elsewhere. If so, those variant readings and annotations were lost with the Baghdad copies. The losses in philosophy compound the devastation further. The Islamic philosophical tradition produced an enormous and sophisticated body of work over 5 centuries. The philosopher Al-Kindi, sometimes called the first Arab philosopher, wrote more than 260 works on subjects including metaphysics, logic, mathematics, music, and the classification of the sciences. Fewer than 40 of those works survive in any form. The philosopher Al-Farabi wrote extensively on political philosophy, logic, music theory, and the relationship between philosophy and religion. His surviving works represent only a portion of his total output. The philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, working in 12th century Spain, produced commentaries on Aristotle that were among the most influential philosophical texts of the medieval period. But Ibn Rushd drew upon a tradition of Islamic commentary on Aristotle that stretched back centuries, and many of the earlier works in that tradition, works that he read and engaged with, are now lost. Each lost philosophical text is not merely a loss of specific arguments or conclusions. It is a loss of a perspective, a way of framing questions, a mode of reasoning, that might have influenced later thinkers in directions we cannot predict. Philosophy advances through dialogue, through the back and forth of argument and counter-argument. When one side of a dialogue is erased, the other side loses its context and some of its meaning. We can read the works that survived, but we cannot fully understand the intellectual environment in which they were produced, because so many of the works that contributed to that environment are gone. Consider the magnitude of this from another angle. Modern scholars estimate that the total output of Islamic scholarship between the 8th and 13th centuries, measured in individual written works, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The number of those works that survive today, in any form, in any library, in any language, is estimated at roughly 10% or less of the total. Some estimates place the survival rate as low as 1% for certain fields and certain periods. That means that for every book from the golden age of Islamic civilization that we can read today, somewhere between 9 and 99 others are gone forever. Not all of those losses can be attributed to the fall of Baghdad alone. Manuscripts were also destroyed in the Crusades, particularly during the sack of cities like Tripoli in Lebanon, whose library was reportedly destroyed by Crusader forces. They were destroyed during the Reconquista in Spain, as Christian armies conquered the Islamic cities of Iberia and sometimes burned their libraries along with their mosques. They were destroyed during the Timurid invasions of the late 14th century, when another wave of Central Asian conquerors swept through the Islamic world. And they were lost through simple neglect and decay over the centuries, as paper rotted, as libraries were abandoned, as institutions lost their funding and their patrons. But Baghdad was the single greatest concentration of these manuscripts. Baghdad was the city where the most important originals were held, where the most comprehensive collections had been assembled, where the broadest range of subjects was represented. Its destruction was the single greatest act of knowledge loss in the history of the Islamic world, and arguably in the history of human civilization. But here is the problem. The loss was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative. What was destroyed included the most advanced scientific and philosophical works of the most advanced intellectual civilization on Earth. These were not dusty relics. These were not outdated texts from a bygone era. These were cutting-edge research documents produced by the finest minds of their generation. They contained observations, calculations, experimental results, and theoretical insights that in many cases had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. The astronomical observations recorded in Baghdad's observatories were unique data points that depended on specific times, specific instruments, and specific locations. They could not be recreated. The medical case studies documented in Baghdad's hospitals recorded the experiences of specific patients with specific diseases under specific conditions. They could not be repeated. The philosophical arguments developed in Baghdad's scholarly circles emerged from specific conversations between specific thinkers at specific moments in the evolution of Islamic thought. They could not be reconstructed. The astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi survived the fall of Baghdad because he had been forcibly recruited by Hulagu Khan before the siege. Hulagu had a pragmatic appreciation for useful scholars, and al-Tusi was one of the most brilliant astronomers alive. After the destruction of Baghdad, al-Tusi persuaded Hulagu to fund the construction of a new observatory at Maraga in northwestern Persia. The Maraga Observatory became one of the great astronomical institutions of the 13th century, and al-Tusi's work there included the development of mathematical models for planetary motion that would later influence Copernicus. But al-Tusi was one man, working with his own memory and his own personal manuscripts. He could not reconstitute the centuries of accumulated observational data that had been stored in Baghdad's astronomical libraries. He could not reconstruct the star catalogues, the planetary tables, the eclipse records, and the detailed logs of celestial movements that generations of astronomers had painstakingly compiled night after night, year after year, decade after decade. Think carefully about what astronomical observations mean. An observation of a star's position made in the year 850 has scientific value that cannot be replicated in the year 1260. The star was in a different position relative to the observer. The planet was at a different point in its orbit. The eclipse happened on a specific date that will not recur in the same alignment for centuries or millennia. Historical astronomical data is, by definition, irreplaceable. When those records were thrown into the Tigris, 4 centuries of irreplaceable night sky observations went with them. No amount of effort, no level of technology, no passage of time could ever recreate what those observers had seen and painstakingly recorded. The loss of astronomical records is particularly poignant because astronomy depends, more than almost any other science, on the accumulation of data over long time periods. Many astronomical phenomena operate on cycles that span decades, centuries, or millennia. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's rotational axis that causes the positions of the stars to shift gradually over time, completes a full cycle in approximately 26,000 years. To understand this phenomenon accurately requires observations spanning as many centuries as possible. The astronomers of Baghdad had inherited observational records stretching back through the Islamic period, through the Byzantine and Sasanian periods, and ultimately through the Babylonian astronomical tradition, to observations made more than 2,000 years before the House of Wisdom was founded. This deep archive of observational data, carefully compiled, cross-referenced, corrected, and annotated by generations of astronomers, was one of the most scientifically valuable collections in human history. Its destruction removed the longest continuous record of celestial observation that existed in the Islamic world, and deprived future astronomers of a dataset that could never be reconstructed. The same principle applies to medical case studies. A physician who documented the symptoms, progression, treatments, and outcomes of thousands of patients over decades of practice created a body of clinical knowledge that depended entirely on those specific encounters. When that documentation was destroyed, the knowledge was not merely delayed. It was permanently erased. The patients were dead. The diseases had run their courses. The treatments had been administered and their effects observed. The observations could never be repeated because the circumstances could never be reproduced. This is what separates the destruction of Baghdad from a fire that destroys a press. A printing press can be rebuilt. The books it produced can be reprinted from other copies. But observational data exists in a single moment of time. Once the record of that moment is lost, the moment itself is gone. The books could theoretically be rewritten. The theories could be rederived. But the data, the painstaking accumulation of specific measurements and observations made at specific times in specific places by specific individuals, was gone forever. And the institutional knowledge was gone as well. The House of Wisdom was not just a collection of books. It was a living community of scholars who taught each other, debated each other, challenged each other, and transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next through personal mentorship. The master-student relationship was central to Islamic scholarly culture. A scholar's intellectual lineage, the chain of teachers from whom he had received his knowledge, was recorded and valued. This chain of transmission, called an isnad in Arabic, was considered essential to the validity of the knowledge itself. A claim was considered more trustworthy if it could be traced through a chain of reliable transmitters back to an authoritative source. When the scholars of Baghdad were killed or scattered, those chains of transmission were broken. A student who had spent 20 years learning advanced astronomical techniques from a master who held unpublished insights and refinements in his own mind lost access to that knowledge the moment the master was killed. The written texts that the student might consult were important, but they did not capture everything. They did not capture the subtle adjustments of technique, the tricks of instrument calibration, the intuitive judgments born of decades of experience that the master had developed and shared only verbally. This tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that cannot easily be written down because it is embedded in practice rather than theory, was destroyed along with the people who carried it. The concept of tacit knowledge, as articulated by the 20th century philosopher Michael Polanyi, illuminates a dimension of the Baghdad catastrophe that purely textual analysis cannot capture. Polanyi argued that human beings know more than they can tell that much of what makes an expert effective is not reducible to explicit rules or written instructions, but exists in the form of embodied skills, trained intuitions, and practical judgments that can only be acquired through direct experience and personal mentorship. A master astronomer could teach a student not just the mathematical formulas for calculating planetary positions, but the practical wisdom of knowing when atmospheric conditions would distort observations, how to detect and correct systematic errors in instruments, and how to recognize anomalous data that might indicate either a measurement error or a genuinely new phenomenon. This practical wisdom was accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted through personal relationships. It existed nowhere except in the minds and habits of the practitioners themselves. When those practitioners were killed, their tacit knowledge vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving no trace in any manuscript, no entry in any bibliography, no reference in any surviving text. The Persian scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, in the aftermath of the destruction, described the fall of Baghdad as a catastrophe without precedent. He wrote of the loss of its libraries as a wound from which Islamic civilization might never fully recover. His assessment, it appears, was tragically accurate. The intellectual energy of the Islamic world, which had been the driving force of global scientific progress for 5 centuries, never fully recovered its pre-1258 momentum. Brilliant scholars continued to work. Great libraries were eventually rebuilt. New discoveries were made. But the trajectory was permanently altered. The accumulated foundation upon which future discoveries would have been built had been shattered. The missing centuries of data, the lost chains of scholarly transmission, the destroyed infrastructure of research and education, all of these absences compounded over time, making recovery slower and more difficult with each passing generation. Some historians have argued that the fall of Baghdad is one of the factors that contributed to the eventual shift of scientific leadership from the Islamic world to Europe. This is a contested and complex argument, and it would be wrong to reduce a centuries-long civilizational transformation to a single event. Many factors contributed to the rise of European science and the relative decline of Islamic scientific output, including economic changes, political fragmentation, shifts in religious attitudes toward inquiry, and the opening of new trade routes. But it is equally wrong to pretend that the destruction of the most advanced intellectual infrastructure in the world had no consequences for the future of human knowledge. The fall of Baghdad did not cause the end of Islamic science, but it dealt that tradition a blow from which it never fully recovered. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. We do not know what we lost. That is the deepest wound. We have references, fragments, quotations, and titles. We know that certain books existed because other scholars mentioned them. We know that certain discoveries were made because they are referenced in surviving texts. But the actual content, the actual arguments, the actual proofs, the actual observations, the actual insights contained in hundreds of thousands of destroyed manuscripts are simply unknown. They are not missing in the sense that they might someday be found in a forgotten archive or a newly discovered cache. They are gone in the sense that the physical objects that carried them no longer exist and no copies survived. We are left with shadows. We can see the outlines of what was there, like the impression left in soil after a heavy statue has been removed. We know something stood in that place. We can roughly guess its shape and size, but we cannot see its face. We cannot know its expression. We cannot read its meaning. The destruction of the House of Wisdom and the libraries of Baghdad is the central catastrophe in this account, but it exists within a much larger story of lost knowledge. Across human history, discoveries have been made, perfected, relied upon for generations, and then lost, sometimes for centuries, sometimes forever. The House of Wisdom contained texts that described, referenced, or built upon many of these lost traditions. Its destruction did not create these losses in every case, but it sealed many of them. It closed the last door to the last room where certain knowledge might still have been found. Let us examine several of the most significant examples of knowledge that humanity once possessed and can no longer fully reproduce. Each of these is a wound in the body of human understanding. Some are healing slowly, others may never heal at all. The first is Greek fire. In the 7th century of the Common Era, the Byzantine Empire deployed a terrifying weapon known as Greek fire. It was a liquid incendiary substance that could be projected from bronze siphon-like devices mounted on the prows of warships. The Byzantines called it liquid fire, or sea fire, or Roman fire. Later Western sources gave it the name Greek fire, and the name has stuck. What made this weapon so devastating and so deeply mysterious to modern researchers was its behavior. It burned on water. It could not be extinguished by water. Pouring water on Greek fire reportedly made it burn more fiercely, not less. Some accounts suggest it could even burn underwater. The Byzantines used it to devastating effect in naval warfare, most notably during the First and Second Arab sieges of Constantinople in 674 to 678 and in 717 to 718. In both cases, Greek fire played a decisive role in the defense of the city and, by extension, in the survival of the Byzantine Empire. The exact composition of Greek fire is unknown. The Byzantine emperors guarded its formula as the most sensitive military secret in their entire arsenal. The secret of its manufacture was restricted to a tiny circle of trusted officials and was reportedly handed down within a single family of technicians. It was never written down in any document that has survived, or if it was, that document was destroyed or hidden so effectively that it has never been found. By the time Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the formula had already been lost, possibly for several centuries. The last definitive use of Greek fire in battle is recorded in the 11th or 12th century. Modern chemists and military historians have proposed various candidates for its composition. The leading theories involve mixtures of naphtha, a liquid hydrocarbon that occurs naturally in the Middle East, combined with other substances that would have given it its characteristic properties. Quicklime, also known as calcium oxide, reacts violently with water and produces intense heat, which would explain the reports that water made Greek fire burn more fiercely. Sulfur, pine resin, and saltpeter have also been proposed as components. Some researchers have suggested that Greek fire was essentially a form of napalm, a sticky, flammable gel that adheres to surfaces and resists extinguishment. Others have proposed more exotic compositions involving phosphorus compounds or distilled petroleum fractions. But here is the problem. No modern recreation has fully replicated all of the properties described in historical sources. Various experiments have produced substances that burn on water or that resist extinguishment, but none has simultaneously reproduced all of the reported characteristics. Burning on water, resistance to extinguishment, adhesion to surfaces, projection through siphon devices, and the particularly intense and prolonged flame described by eyewitnesses. The complete formula, the specific combination of ingredients, and the precise methods of preparation and deployment remains unknown. The connection to the House of Wisdom and the libraries of Baghdad is significant. The Arab forces who faced Greek fire in battle had powerful incentives to understand and replicate the weapon. Arab alchemists and military engineers almost certainly studied captured samples, interviewed prisoners, and conducted their own experiments. The Islamic world had a robust tradition of chemical research, and its alchemists were among the most skilled experimentalists in the medieval world. It would be surprising, given the breadth and depth of Arabic scientific literature, if no one had written about Greek fire, its composition, its effects, or efforts to recreate it. If such treatises existed in Baghdad's libraries, and given the comprehensive nature of those collections, the probability is high they were destroyed along with everything else. The second example is Damascus steel. For centuries, swordsmiths in the Middle East and South Asia produced blades of extraordinary quality using a type of steel known as Damascus steel or Wootz steel. These blades were famous across the medieval world for three distinctive characteristics. First, they displayed a striking wavy or ladder-like pattern on the surface of the metal, a pattern that could not be replicated by surface decoration, and that emerged from the internal structure of the steel itself. Second, they were exceptionally sharp, with edges that could reportedly cut through silk scarves dropped onto them, and that held their sharpness through prolonged combat. Third, they combined hardness with flexibility in a way that seemed paradoxical. A Damascus steel blade could be hard enough to hold a razor edge and yet flexible enough to bend without breaking, a combination that European swordsmiths struggled to achieve. Damascus steel was produced using a specific type of high-carbon steel ingot called woots, which was smelted primarily in southern India and Sri Lanka. The production of woots involved heating iron ore with carbon-rich plant materials in sealed clay crucibles at precisely controlled temperatures. The resulting ingots, small cakes of steel with a distinctive crystalline structure, were then exported along trade routes that passed through the Persian Gulf and overland through Persia to the great metalworking centers of Damascus, Baghdad, and other Middle Eastern cities. There, master swordsmiths forged the woots ingots into finished blades, using techniques that involved repeated cycles of heating, folding, and hammering at carefully controlled temperatures. The process of turning a woots ingot into a finished Damascus blade was not merely a matter of following a recipe. It required a deep, intuitive understanding of the behavior of the metal at different temperatures, a sensitivity to visual and tactile cues that could only be developed through years of apprenticeship. The master swordsmiths passed their knowledge to apprentices over the course of decades, and much of that knowledge was never written down. It was embodied knowledge stored in the hands and eyes and judgment of the craftsman rather than in texts. By the 18th century, the art of making true Damascus steel had been completely lost. The Indian woots production centers had declined. The trade routes that supplied the Middle Eastern forges had been disrupted, and the chains of master-to-apprentice transmission had been broken. Modern metallurgists have spent decades attempting to recreate it. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers used electron microscopy and advanced analytical techniques to examine surviving Damascus steel blades and discovered something remarkable. The steel contained carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, structures at a scale of billionths of a meter that are at the frontier of modern materials science. The medieval swordsmiths were, without knowing the molecular-level mechanisms, producing a material that contained nanostructures. The math is striking. A technology that produced nanoscale material structures existed in the medieval period, was practiced successfully for centuries, relied upon in warfare across multiple continents, and was then lost. Modern science, with electron microscopes, spectroscopic analysis, computational modeling, and theoretical frameworks that the medieval smiths could not have imagined, took decades merely to understand what those smiths had accomplished. And the question of whether true woots Damascus steel has been fully replicated remains open. Some modern researchers have achieved partial success, producing blades with similar patterns and some similar properties, but the consensus is that the full art has not been recovered. The connection to Baghdad is direct. Baghdad was one of the principal centers of the Damascus steel trade. Its metal workers were among the most skilled in the world. Its bazaars sold Damascus steel blades to customers from across the Islamic world and beyond, and its scholars, with their systematic approach to documenting craft knowledge, may well have produced written accounts of the metallurgical techniques involved. The destruction of Baghdad disrupted not only the physical infrastructure of blade production, but also the written and oral traditions that supported it. The chain of knowledge, from Indian smelter to Middle Eastern forger to scholar, was severed. The third example is Roman concrete. The ancient Romans built structures using a type of concrete that has in many cases lasted more than 2,000 years. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 126 of the Common Era, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It is still standing. It has been standing for nearly 2,000 years. Its dome spans over 43 meters and contains no steel reinforcement, no iron rods, nothing but concrete. Modern Portland cement concrete, the material that makes up the foundations and structures of virtually every modern building, begins to deteriorate after roughly 50 to 100 years, depending on environmental conditions. The Romans built with a material that was, in certain applications, dramatically more durable than anything we use today. How did they achieve this? Research published in the early 21st century by scientists at the University of Utah, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and several Italian research institutions has revealed several key factors. Roman concrete used a specific type of volcanic ash called pozzolana, found in abundance near the city of Pozzuoli on the Bay of Naples. This ash was mixed with lime and, in maritime applications, with seawater. The interaction of these materials produced a chemical reaction that generated crystals of aluminum tobermarite and philipsite, minerals that form plate-like and needle-like microstructures within the concrete matrix. These mineral structures reinforce the concrete at a microscopic level, filling pores and binding the material together with increasing strength over time. When cracks formed in Roman concrete exposed to seawater, the infiltrating water triggered further mineral growth that effectively healed the cracks. The concrete grew stronger over time rather than weaker. The Romans used this material extensively for harbours, breakwaters, aqueducts, domes, and foundations. Their engineering texts, particularly the work of Vitruvius, who wrote his treatise De Architectura in the 1st century before the Common Era, contain general descriptions of concrete-making techniques. Vitruvius described the proportions of lime, pozzolana, and aggregate that should be used for different types of construction, but the specific details, the exact preparation methods, the curing times and conditions, the many practical refinements that distinguished a skilled Roman concrete maker from an unskilled one were largely transmitted through practice rather than through text. When the institutional structures of the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century of the Common Era, the communities of practice that had maintained this knowledge dissolved, and the techniques were lost. Here, too, the Islamic world may have preserved a link. Arab engineers and architects inherited some Roman construction knowledge through the Byzantine Empire and through direct study of surviving Roman structures in the territories they conquered. Roman ruins were abundant throughout the former provinces of the empire, and Arab builders examined them with practical interest. Texts on construction, architecture, and materials science were among the many categories of knowledge collected in Baghdad's libraries. Whether any of these texts contained specific information about Roman concrete formulations, specific enough to allow the technique to be reproduced, is a question that cannot be answered because the texts no longer exist. The irony of the Roman concrete story has not been lost on modern researchers. In the 21st century, as concerns about the environmental impact of Portland cement production have grown, scientists have turned to Roman concrete as a potential model for more sustainable building materials. The production of Portland cement requires heating limestone and clay to extremely high temperatures, a process that generates approximately 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Roman concrete, by contrast, could be produced at lower temperatures and used naturally occurring volcanic materials that required minimal processing. If the full details of Roman concrete production had been preserved, if the chain of knowledge from Roman builders through Byzantine and Arab intermediaries to the modern world had remained intact, the development of more sustainable building materials might have proceeded centuries earlier. Instead, modern researchers are essentially reverse engineering a 2,000-year-old technology from surviving samples, a process that has taken decades and is still incomplete. The knowledge existed, it was lost, and the cost of that loss is being paid today in carbon emissions that a preserved technology might have helped to avoid. The fourth example is the Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, Greek sponge divers working off the coast of the small island of Antikythera, between Crete and the southern tip of mainland Greece, recovered a badly corroded lump of bronze and wood from the remains of an ancient shipwreck. The wreck dated to roughly the 1st century before the Common Era. Based on the style of the pottery and other artifacts recovered alongside it, the bronze lump was brought to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, where it sat for decades, largely ignored, while curators focused on the more visually impressive bronze statues recovered from the same wreck. It was not until researchers began examining the corroded fragments with X-ray imaging in the mid-20th century that the true nature of the object became apparent. The lump contained the remains of a complex mechanical device composed of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears. The gears were precision-cut, with teeth that meshed accurately enough to transmit rotational motion through the mechanism. The device had dials on its front and back faces, with inscriptions in ancient Greek that described its functions. It was, in modern terms, a mechanical analog computer designed to predict the positions of the sun and moon, to track the cycles of the ancient Greek calendar, to predict solar and lunar eclipses, and to calculate the timing of the ancient Pan-Hellenic athletic festivals, including the Olympic Games. Nothing like the Antikythera mechanism had been known to exist in the ancient world. The level of precision gear cutting and mechanical sophistication it displayed was not thought to have been achieved until the development of astronomical clocks in late medieval Europe more than 1,000 years later. Its discovery forced a complete and painful reassessment of ancient technological capabilities. The Greeks, or the Hellenistic artisans who produced the mechanism, had mastered a level of mechanical engineering that mainstream historical scholarship had simply not recognized. And it gets stranger. The Antikythera mechanism was too sophisticated to be a first attempt. It represents the product of a mature engineering tradition, one that must have included earlier, simpler mechanisms, and a body of theoretical and practical knowledge about gear trains, astronomical cycles, and precision metalworking. Where are the predecessors? Where are the workshop manuals? Where are the theoretical treatises that explained the astronomical models that the mechanism embodied? Where are the other mechanisms that must have been built alongside it or before it? Some clues exist in ancient texts. The Roman orator Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described mechanical devices that modelled the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. He attributed one such device to the great mathematician and engineer Archimedes, who lived in Syracuse in the 3rd century before the Common Era. If Archimedes built mechanical astronomical models, then the tradition that produced the Antikythera mechanism stretches back at least 2 centuries before the device itself was built. Descriptions of such devices may have existed in the works of Archimedes and other Greek engineers, works that were available in the Library of Alexandria that were later translated into Arabic during the Great Translation movement of the 9th century, and that may have been studied, extended, and refined by Islamic scholars. The lost engineering treatises of the ancient world represent one of the most frustrating categories of missing knowledge. The ancient Greeks and Romans produced a body of technical literature on mechanics, hydraulics, pneumatics, and architectural engineering that was far more extensive than what survives. Heron of Alexandria, working in the 1st century of the Common Era, wrote treatises on pneumatics, automata, and mechanics that describe devices of remarkable ingenuity, including a primitive steam engine called an aeolipile, coin-operated vending machines, self-opening temple doors powered by heated air, and wind-powered organs. His surviving works hint at a tradition of practical engineering that was more sophisticated and more widespread than the fragmentary evidence allows us to fully reconstruct. Hero himself references earlier engineers and earlier treatises, most of which are lost. The tradition he worked within was not the creation of a single genius, but the accumulated product of centuries of practical experimentation and theoretical refinement, most of which has vanished. The Arab world inherited and extended this engineering tradition. The Banu Musa brothers, 3 scholars who worked at the House of Wisdom in the 9th century, wrote the Book of Ingenious Devices, which described over 100 mechanical and hydraulic devices, including trick vessels, fountains, musical automata, and self-trimming lamps. Their work demonstrates a direct engagement with the Greek mechanical tradition, extended with original innovations. The book survives in several manuscript copies, but it is likely only a fraction of the mechanical engineering literature that existed in Baghdad during the Golden Age. How many other treatises on mechanics, hydraulics, and engineering were produced by scholars who are now forgotten? How many devices were built, documented, and then lost when the documentation was destroyed? The Arab engineer Ismail al-Jazari, working at the court of the Artukid dynasty in what is now southeastern Turkey in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, produced a famous illustrated book called The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. This book described and illustrated dozens of complex mechanical devices, including automata that served drinks and washed hands, elaborate water clocks with moving figures, musical automata, and mechanical puzzles. Al-Jazari's work demonstrates that a robust and sophisticated tradition of mechanical engineering existed in the Islamic world in the centuries before the fall of Baghdad. His devices used gears, cams, crankshafts, and other mechanical elements that show a deep understanding of the principles of mechanism. How much of this tradition was documented in texts held in Baghdad and destroyed in 1258? We do not know, and the extent of our ignorance is itself telling. Al-Jazari worked in a regional court, not in Baghdad itself, and his book survived because copies were made outside the zone of Mongol destruction. But he was part of a larger tradition, and that tradition must have produced other books, other manuals, other technical treatises that did not have the fortune of being copied and preserved in distant libraries. How many Al-Jazaris are there whose names and works have been completely erased? The fifth example takes us to an entirely different register of loss: the destruction of the Maya codices. In 1562, the Spanish friar Diego de Landa, serving as the ecclesiastical authority in the Yucatan Peninsula, ordered the destruction of thousands of Maya manuscripts. The Maya civilization had developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas, a complex system of hieroglyphic signs that could represent both words and syllables. They had developed advanced mathematics, including the independent invention of the concept of zero, which they used in a vigesimal or base 20 number system of considerable power. They had created astronomical calendars of remarkable precision, tracking the cycles of Venus, Mars, and the Moon with accuracy that matched or exceeded contemporary European astronomy. And they recorded their history, their mythology, their astronomical tables, and their ritual calendars in books made from bark paper, coated with a thin layer of lime plaster, folded in accordion style and painted with detailed hieroglyphic texts and illustrations. De Landa burned them. He later wrote, with a casualness that is difficult to read without a sense of outrage, that the books contained nothing but superstition and falsehoods of the devil, and that the Maya wept bitterly to see their books destroyed, and that it caused them affliction. The word affliction hardly captures the magnitude of what De Landa did. He destroyed the written record of an entire civilization. Today, only 4 Maya codices are known to survive in the entire world. 4. Out of what was almost certainly a tradition of thousands or tens of thousands of manuscripts, produced over centuries by a literate civilization that spanned a large portion of Central America. The Dresden Codex, held in Dresden, Germany, contains astronomical tables of extraordinary sophistication, including calculations of the Venus cycle that are accurate to within 2 hours over a period of 500 years. The Madrid Codex contains almanacs and ritual calendars. The Paris Codex contains prophecies and astronomical information. The Grolier Codex, whose authenticity was debated for decades before being confirmed in 2016, contains a Venus table similar to the one in the Dresden Codex. From these 4 documents, and from the thousands of hieroglyphic inscriptions carved on stone monuments throughout the Maya region, scholars have been able to reconstruct significant portions of Maya history, astronomy, and religious practice. The decipherment of the Maya script, achieved largely in the second half of the 20th century through the work of scholars including Yuri Knorosov, Tatiana Proskoryakov, and David Stewart, was one of the great intellectual achievements of the modern era. But the decipherment also revealed how much has been lost. The inscriptions on stone monuments are primarily historical and dynastic in character, recording the deeds of kings and the outcomes of wars. The codices, the bark paper books, contained the broader intellectual tradition, the mathematics, the astronomy, the ritual knowledge, the mythology, and possibly the literary works of the Maya civilization. Almost all of that is gone. The Maya case illustrates a different dimension of knowledge loss. The destruction was not a byproduct of conquest or siege. It was deliberate and targeted. It was ideological. The books were destroyed not because they were in the way of a military objective, but because they carried a worldview that the destroyers wanted to erase. De Landa did not burn the Maya codices out of indifference. He burned them out of conviction. He believed they were dangerous and that their destruction was a moral good. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad had different motivations. The Mongols were not ideologically opposed to books or to learning. They were, in many cases, pragmatically interested in the knowledge of the peoples they conquered. Hulagu Khan himself later became a patron of the sciences. He funded the Maraga Observatory. He employed scholars, physicians, and engineers at his court. The destruction of Baghdad's libraries was part of the general sack of the city, an act of military intimidation and plunder, not a targeted campaign against knowledge. This distinction matters because it makes the Mongol destruction, in a sense, even more devastating. The books were not destroyed because they were feared or hated. They were destroyed because no one in the moment of destruction thought they were worth saving. They were collateral damage. They were, in the judgment of the conquering army, worthless. But the result was the same as if they had been burned with ideological fervour. The knowledge was gone. The pattern of catastrophic knowledge loss extends further still. The Nalanda University in Bihar, India, was one of the great centres of Buddhist learning for nearly 800 years, from the 5th century to the 12th century of the Common Era. At its peak, Nalanda housed over 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers, drawn from across Asia. Its library complex, known as Dharmaganja, or Treasury of Truth, consisted of 3 enormous multi-story buildings. According to Tibetan accounts, one of these buildings was 9 stories tall. The manuscripts, written on palm leaves in Sanskrit and Pali, covered every branch of Buddhist philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, and astronomy. When the forces of the Turkic military commander Bakhtiar Khilji attacked Nalanda in 1193, they reportedly put the monks to the sword and set fire to the library. The flames burned for 3 months. 3 months. Consider the volume of written material required to sustain a fire for that length of time. The Buddhist intellectual tradition in India, which had flourished for over a millennium, never recovered from this blow. Buddhism itself virtually disappeared from the Indian subcontinent in the centuries that followed, though it continued to thrive in other parts of Asia, where its texts and traditions had been separately preserved. The library at Nalanda, like the libraries of Baghdad, was a concentration point, a place where the most complete and authoritative versions of an entire scholarly tradition were gathered together. And like Baghdad, its destruction eliminated not just individual texts, but the institutional framework that produced, curated, and transmitted them. The destruction of knowledge is not always spectacular. Sometimes it is quiet, gradual, and almost invisible. The slow decay of the papyrus collections of the ancient world is a case in point. Papyrus, the primary writing material of classical antiquity, is made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grows in the marshes of the Nile Delta. It is light, flexible, and excellent for writing, but it is also organic and therefore vulnerable to moisture, insects, and mold. In the dry climate of Egypt, papyrus can survive for thousands of years. The oldest surviving papyrus fragments date to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, but in the humid climates of Greece, Italy, and the rest of Europe, papyrus deteriorates rapidly. The vast majority of Greek and Roman texts that were originally written on papyrus have simply rotted away over the centuries. The works of the great Greek dramatists, philosophers, historians, and scientists survived only if they were copied onto parchment by Byzantine scribes before the papyrus originals decayed beyond legibility. And the copying was selective. Scribes copied what was popular, what was considered important, what was being taught in schools. Works that had fallen out of fashion, that dealt with obscure subjects, or that existed in only a few copies, were at highest risk of being lost when their papyrus medium finally crumbled to dust. The Greek tragedian Sophocles wrote over 120 plays. 7 survive. The Greek comedian Menander wrote over 100 plays. 1 survives complete, and fragments of several others. The philosopher Democritus, who proposed the atomic theory of matter, wrote over 70 works. None survives complete. The historian Livy wrote a comprehensive history of Rome in 142 books. 35 survive. For every ancient text that reached the modern world, dozens or hundreds did not. The survival rate for ancient Greek literature has been estimated at roughly 1 to 2% of total production. 98% or more of everything the Greeks wrote is gone. These losses occurred slowly, through the gradual decay of papyrus and the selective copying choices of medieval scribes. They were not the result of a single catastrophe, but of a slow erosion over centuries. Yet their cumulative effect is devastating. We study ancient Greek civilization through a tiny, biased sample of its total intellectual output, and we have no way to know what the missing 98% contained. Perhaps the greatest Greek philosopher was someone whose works were not copied because they were considered unfashionable in the Byzantine period. Perhaps the most profound Greek scientific insight was buried in an obscure treatise that no scribe thought worth preserving. We cannot know, because the evidence is gone. Let us turn to the mystery of undeciphered scripts, because these represent yet another category of knowledge loss, one where the physical records survive, but the meaning is locked away. Linear A is a writing system used in ancient Crete during the Minoan civilization, from roughly 1800 to 1450 before the Common Era. Despite more than a century of study, Linear A has never been deciphered. Thousands of inscriptions exist, found on clay tablets, stone libation vessels, and metal objects throughout the Aegean. The symbols are visible. They can be photographed, catalogued, and statistically analyzed. But the language they encode is unknown. It is not Greek. It is not any Semitic language. It may belong to a language family that has no surviving members, a family of languages that has been completely extinct for over 3,000 years. Linear B, a related script used later in Crete and on mainland Greece, was famously deciphered in 1952 by the British architect and amateur linguist Michael Ventris. Ventris showed that Linear B encoded an early form of Greek called Mycenaean Greek, and his decipherment opened a window into the administrative life of the Mycenaean palaces. But Linear A encodes a different, older, unknown language, and without a bilingual inscription, a text written in both Linear A and a known language, the prospects for decipherment are dim. The Minoan civilization that used Linear A was one of the most remarkable in the ancient Mediterranean. The Minoans built the great palace complex at Knossos, which covered an area of roughly 22,000 square meters and contained hundreds of rooms, including storage facilities, workshops, ceremonial halls, and what appear to be administrative offices. They controlled a maritime trading network that spanned the eastern Mediterranean. They produced art of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. Their written records presumably contain histories, administrative details, religious texts, and perhaps literary works. But until Linear A is deciphered, if it is ever deciphered, all of that knowledge remains sealed behind a wall of incomprehension. The Indus Valley script presents a parallel and perhaps even more frustrating mystery. The Harappan civilization, which flourished in the Indus and Gagahakra river valleys from roughly 3300 to 1900 before the Common Era, was one of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world. Its two largest cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, had populations estimated in the tens of thousands. The Harappan people traded with Mesopotamia, used standardized weights and measures, built cities on grid plans with sophisticated drainage systems, and created a body of material culture that suggests a highly organized and technically capable society. And they left behind thousands of inscribed objects, primarily small stone seals bearing combinations of symbols, alongside images of animals, human figures, and abstract designs. Despite decades of study by linguists, archaeologists, and computer scientists, the Indus script has not been deciphered. The inscriptions are short, rarely more than 5 symbols long, and the underlying language is unknown. Some scholars have questioned whether the Indus signs represent a true writing system at all, suggesting that they may be a system of non-linguistic symbols analogous to heraldic emblems or trademark logos. Others insist that they are writing, and that the shortness of the inscriptions reflects the limited surface area of the seals, rather than a limited expressive capability. The debate continues, and the meaning of the Indus script remains one of the great unsolved problems in the study of ancient civilizations. These undeciphered scripts represent knowledge that still physically exists, but is functionally lost. The objects survive, the symbols are visible, but the meaning they carry is inaccessible to every living person on Earth. They are messages from the past that we can see but cannot hear. They sit in museum cases and archive drawers, patiently waiting for someone to find the key that will unlock their meaning. They may wait forever. The language that would make them speak may be extinct beyond recovery, its last speaker dead thousands of years before the first attempt at decipherment was made. The clay endures, the stone endures, but the voice is silent. Now consider the inverse case. The manuscripts of Baghdad did not survive physically, but we know, from references in other texts, what some of them said. We can reconstruct, partially and imperfectly, some of the lost knowledge by studying the works of later scholars who read and cited the destroyed originals. This is, in fact, how much of Greek philosophy and science was preserved through the Islamic translation movement. Texts were translated, copies were distributed to libraries across the Islamic world, and some of those copies survived in Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus, Fez, and Samarkand even when the Baghdad originals were destroyed. The surviving copies then travelled to Europe through the translation schools of Toledo, Palermo, and other centres of cross-cultural exchange, where they were translated from Arabic into Latin and became the foundation of the European scholastic tradition. But this process of reconstruction is painfully incomplete. For every lost text that is referenced in a surviving work, there may be 10 or 100 that are not referenced anywhere. These are the unknown unknowns of intellectual history. We do not know what they said. We do not know who wrote them. We do not even know that they existed. They were simply present in the libraries of Baghdad, unread by anyone who later produced a surviving text, and they were destroyed without leaving any trace at all. There have been, over the centuries, various attempts to recover fragments of what was lost. Manuscript hunters have combed the libraries, mosques, and private collections of the Islamic world, searching for unknown copies of texts that were thought to have perished. In the 19th and 20th centuries, European and Middle Eastern scholars discovered important manuscripts in unexpected locations. The scholar Heinrich Suter found Arabic mathematical manuscripts in European libraries, where they had sat unrecognized for centuries. The Turkish scholar Fuat Sezgin, who died in 2018 after a lifetime of work on the history of Islamic science, compiled a monumental bibliography of Arabic scientific literature that runs to 14 volumes and catalogues thousands of surviving texts alongside thousands more that are known only by title. Sezgin's work is both a monument to what survives and a memorial to what is gone. His bibliography reads, in many sections, like an extended catalogue of absence, title after title, author after author, marked with the notation that no manuscript is known to exist. These are the ghosts of Baghdad's libraries. We know their names. We sometimes know their subjects. We occasionally know fragments of their content, quoted in the works of other scholars. But we cannot read them. They are entries in a register of the dead. The work of manuscript recovery continues today, driven by both scholarly determination and technological innovation. In the libraries and mosques of Timbuktu, in the archives of Istanbul, in the private collections of families in Cairo and Damascus and Fez, manuscripts continue to be identified and catalogued. The Timbuktu Manuscripts Project, supported by international organizations and the South African government, has worked to preserve and digitize hundreds of thousands of manuscripts held in private family libraries in the Saharan city of Timbuktu. Many of these manuscripts are Arabic scientific and philosophical texts that were copied from originals held in the great libraries of the Islamic world. While most of the Timbuktu manuscripts date from the 15th century or later, some contain copies of much earlier works, and the process of cataloguing and studying them is ongoing. Each newly identified manuscript holds the possibility, however slim, of containing a copy of a text that was thought to have been lost in the destruction of Baghdad or another medieval catastrophe. In recent decades, the digitization of manuscript collections around the world has accelerated the process of cross-referencing and identification. A scholar in London can now compare a fragment held in a German library with a manuscript page in a Turkish archive without either document leaving its home institution. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Collegeville, Minnesota, has photographed and digitized hundreds of thousands of manuscript pages from collections in the Middle East, many of them from private and institutional collections that had never been systematically catalogued. The work is slow, meticulous, and often discouraging. but it has occasionally produced remarkable discoveries. Manuscripts that were thought to exist in only a single copy have been found to have siblings in unexpected locations. Texts that were known only by title have occasionally surfaced in collections where they had been miscatalogued or overlooked for centuries. Modern digital technology has opened new avenues for partial recovery. Multispectral imaging can reveal text that has been overwritten on palimpsests, manuscripts that were scraped clean of their original text and reused for new writing. The Archimedes palimpsest, a medieval prayer book created by scraping and overwriting a collection of works by the Greek mathematician Archimedes, was subjected to multispectral imaging in the early 21st century and yielded previously unknown texts, including a treatise on combinatorics that is the earliest known work on that mathematical subject. If palimpsests containing overwritten Arabic texts from the Baghdad tradition exist in European or Middle Eastern libraries, and it is possible that they do, modern imaging technology might reveal them. But the manuscripts that were thrown into the Tigris are beyond the reach of any imaging technology ever developed or foreseeable. Paper dissolves in water. The cellulose fibers that make up paper absorb water and break apart. The carbon-based inks used in medieval Arabic manuscripts disperse into solution and are carried away by the current. Within hours or days of being thrown into the river, the physical objects that carried 5 centuries of accumulated knowledge cease to exist as readable documents. No technique, no matter how advanced, can recover text from paper that has been dissolved in a river and dispersed into the waters of the Persian Gulf. We are left, then, with the fragments, the quotations, the references, the titles, the names of authors whose works we will never read, and the unsettling knowledge that behind all of these partial recoveries, behind the known losses and the catalogued absences, there lies a vast, immeasurable void of completely unknown losses, books that no one ever cited, discoveries that no one ever referenced, thoughts that were committed to paper and then erased from the world without leaving any trace at all. Then something happened that changes the way we think about all of this. In the modern age, scholars began to realize that the losses were not merely additive, they were multiplicative. Each lost text was not just a single unit of missing knowledge, it was a missing node in a network. It was a connection point to other texts, other ideas, other scholars. When a node was removed, the connections it supported were also lost. When many nodes were removed simultaneously, entire sections of the network collapsed. The web of knowledge did not merely shrink when Baghdad fell. It fragmented into isolated pieces, each cut off from the others, and the fragments, isolated from each other, lost much of the meaning they had possessed when they were connected. What we have discussed so far is the loss of specific texts, specific technologies, and specific bodies of knowledge. These losses are painful and, to the extent that references survive, well documented, but there is a deeper truth beneath them, a truth that is more disturbing because it concerns not what we have lost, but what loss itself means for the trajectory of human civilization. The standard narrative of human progress, the story most of us absorb from schooling and popular culture, goes something like this. Knowledge accumulates over time. Each generation builds upon the discoveries of the previous generation. The arc of history bends toward greater understanding, greater capability, greater mastery of the natural world. Setbacks occur, but they are temporary. The general trend is upward. Progress is the default direction of human civilization, and any interruption to that progress is an anomaly, a deviation from the natural path that will eventually be corrected. The history of the House of Wisdom and the other great knowledge destructions in human history tells a very different story. Progress is not inevitable. It is not the default condition of human civilization. It is fragile, contingent, dependent on specific institutions and specific people, and specific chains of transmission that can be severed with terrifying ease. Civilizations can and do forget what they once knew. Technologies can and do disappear. Scientific traditions can and do collapse. The arc of history does not always bend upward. Sometimes it breaks. And when it breaks, the repair can take centuries, if it happens at all. Let that sink in. The golden age of Islamic science lasted roughly from the 8th to the 13th century of the Common Era. During that period, spanning approximately 500 years, the scholars of the Islamic world made original contributions to mathematics, astronomy, optics, medicine, chemistry, engineering, and philosophy that were, in many cases, not matched or surpassed by European scholars for centuries afterward. They did not merely preserve Greek knowledge, as is sometimes dismissively and inaccurately suggested by those who wish to minimize their contributions. They transformed Greek knowledge. They extended it. They tested it against empirical observation, and, where it was found wanting, they replaced it with something better. They combined it with Indian, Persian, Chinese, and Babylonian intellectual traditions to create a synthesis that was genuinely new, more powerful, and more comprehensive than any of its component parts. Then Baghdad fell, and the intellectual center of the Islamic world was destroyed. And while brilliant scholars continued to work in the Islamic world after 1258, and while important discoveries continued to be made in centers like Cairo, Damascus, Samarkand, and Istanbul, the institutional momentum was broken. The great project of systematic scientific inquiry, supported by state patronage, concentrated in major research institutions, and sustained by a culture that valued knowledge as one of the highest human pursuits, was disrupted so severely that it never fully recovered its former scale, its former ambition, or its former productivity. This is not science fiction. This is documented history, attested by the manuscript record, confirmed by bibliographic analysis, and acknowledged by historians of science from multiple cultural traditions. A civilization that was the undisputed world leader in scientific inquiry for 5 centuries suffered a catastrophic material and institutional blow and never returned to its former position of dominance. The knowledge did not simply migrate elsewhere. Much of it was destroyed outright, and the knowledge that survived was scattered across distant collections, separated from the institutional context that had made it productive, isolated from the scholarly communities that had given it meaning. Consider what this means in concrete, practical, measurable terms. The astronomers of the Islamic world were, in the 12th and 13th centuries, actively developing mathematical models of planetary motion that directly anticipated the work of Nicolaus Copernicus. 3 centuries later, the so-called Tusi couple, a mathematical device invented by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi for converting uniform circular motion into oscillating linear motion along a diameter, appears in virtually identical form in Copernicus's major work, De Revolutionibus, published in 1543. The mathematician Ibn al-Shatir, working in Damascus in the 14th century, developed a planetary model that is mathematically equivalent to the model Copernicus later proposed for the motion of the moon. Whether Copernicus knew of these Islamic mathematical innovations directly, having encountered them through some channel of transmission that has not yet been documented, or reinvented them independently, is a question that historians are still debating. But the fact itself is beyond dispute. The mathematical tools that Copernicus used to build his heliocentric model existed in the Islamic world centuries before he was born. Now ask yourself a question. If Baghdad had not fallen, if the House of Wisdom and its associated institutions had continued to function, if the astronomical research program that produced al-Tusi and Ibn al-Shatir had continued uninterrupted, how long would it have taken for someone in that tradition to arrive at the heliocentric model? The mathematical tools were in place. The observational data was being gathered. The theoretical framework was evolving in a direction that pointed, with increasing clarity, toward the conclusion that the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the reverse. The conceptual leap from the Tusi couple and the Ibn al-Shatir model to a fully heliocentric system was not enormous. It was, in retrospect, a step that the Islamic astronomical tradition was approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Would the heliocentric model have been proposed in the late 13th century, in the 14th, in the 15th? We cannot know. Counterfactual history is speculative by nature, and any specific prediction would be irresponsible. But the direction of the speculation is deeply unsettling. It suggests that the destruction of Baghdad may have delayed the development of one of the most important scientific insights in human history, by somewhere between 100 and 300 years. Not by a generation, by centuries. Let that sink in. The implications cascade outward from that single possibility. If the heliocentric model had been established earlier, the scientific revolution, the great transformation in the way human beings understood and investigated the natural world might have begun earlier as well. The development of the telescope, the formulation of the laws of motion, the development of calculus, the discovery of gravity, all of these might have occurred on an accelerated timeline, and if the scientific revolution had begun earlier, its practical applications, the technologies that transformed human life, would also have arrived earlier. Consider medicine, the germ theory of disease, the understanding that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms rather than by bad air or divine punishment, was not established in Europe until the 19th century, through the work of Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and their contemporaries. Once the germ theory was accepted, the development of antiseptic surgery, vaccination, and antibiotics followed within decades. These developments saved millions, eventually billions, of lives. If the scientific tradition that was flourishing in Baghdad in the 13th century had continued without interruption, would the germ theory have been discovered earlier? Would antibiotics have been developed in the 16th century rather than the 20th? How many of the hundreds of millions of people who died of infectious diseases between the 13th and 19th centuries might have been saved? These questions cannot be answered definitively. They involve too many variables, too many contingencies, too many factors that we cannot control or predict. But they are not idle speculation. They point toward a truth that is both profound and deeply uncomfortable. The destruction of knowledge does not merely erase the past, it steals from the future. Every lost manuscript, every destroyed library, every broken chain of scholarly transmission represents not just knowledge that was possessed and then lost, but knowledge that would have been built upon and extended and applied in ways that we can only dimly imagine. The loss compounds over time, like interest on a debt that can never be repaid. Each year that passes without the missing knowledge is a year in which the advances that knowledge would have enabled do not occur. Mathematicians and historians of science have tried to quantify this compounding effect, though any such quantification is necessarily imprecise. The key insight is that scientific progress is not linear, but exponential. Each new discovery opens the door to multiple subsequent discoveries. A single mathematical technique can enable advances in dozens of applied fields. A single empirical observation can trigger a cascade of theoretical revisions. When a body of foundational knowledge is destroyed, the loss is not merely the knowledge itself. It is the entire tree of subsequent discoveries that would have grown from those foundations. The branches that were never built cannot be measured because they exist only in possibility, but the scale of the loss grows with each passing generation. Consider the specific case of algebra. Al-Khwarizmi's foundational work survived, and through its transmission to Europe via the translation schools of Toledo and Sicily, it became the basis of the European algebraic tradition. But Al-Khwarizmi was not the only algebraist working in Baghdad. Later, mathematicians, including Abu Kamil al-Karaji and Omar Khayyam, extended his methods in increasingly sophisticated directions. Al-Karaji, working in Baghdad around the year 1000, made advances in the manipulation of algebraic expressions and in the theory of mathematical induction that were not paralleled in Europe until centuries later. Some of his works survive, many do not. The algebraic tradition that he represented was broader and deeper than the few surviving texts can convey, and the lost works in that tradition represent lost foundations that later mathematicians could not build upon. The same compounding effect applies to optics, to chemistry, to medicine, to every field in which the scholars of the Islamic world were actively working. Each field represented a stream of research whose interruption affected not just that field, but every other field that drew upon it. Optics feeds into astronomy, which feeds into navigation, which feeds into cartography, which feeds into exploration, which feeds into the understanding of geography, biology, and natural history. Medicine feeds into pharmacology, which feeds into chemistry, which feeds into material science. Mathematics feeds into everything. When the scholarly tradition that sustained these interconnected streams of research was shattered. The damage propagated across disciplines in ways that are impossible to fully trace. The interconnectedness of knowledge is a theme that runs throughout the history of science, but it is particularly evident in the Islamic scholarly tradition. The scholars of the House of Wisdom did not work in narrow disciplinary silos. A mathematician might also be an astronomer and a physician. A philosopher might write on music theory, optics, and theology. This breadth was not dilettantism. It was a reflection of a genuine intellectual culture that saw knowledge as a unified whole, where insights in one field could illuminate problems in another. Al-Kindi wrote on mathematics, astronomy, optics, music, pharmacology, and philosophy. Al-Biruni wrote on mathematics, astronomy, geography, mineralogy, history, and comparative religion. Ibn Sina wrote on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, logic, and theology. When scholars of this breadth and integration were killed or scattered, the losses were not compartmentalized. They rippled across every domain of knowledge that those scholars had touched. The pattern is not unique to Baghdad. It repeats throughout human history with depressing regularity. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of the Common Era led to a period of sharply reduced literacy, technological capability, and institutional complexity in Western Europe. Technologies that the Romans had mastered, including large-scale concrete construction, centralized water supply and sewage systems, underfloor heating, large-scale glass production, and the maintenance of a vast road network, were lost or severely degraded within a few generations. Some of these technologies were not fully recovered in Europe until the Renaissance or later, a gap of roughly 1,000 years. The Spanish destruction of indigenous American knowledge systems, discussed earlier in the context of the Maya codices, erased scientific and cultural traditions that had been developed over millennia on an entire continent. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca civilizations each possessed sophisticated bodies of astronomical, mathematical, agricultural, and medical knowledge that were developed independently of the Old World traditions. Much of this knowledge was destroyed in the 16th century and has never been recovered. The destruction was driven by a combination of military conquest, religious ideology, and cultural contempt, and it represents one of the most comprehensive erasures of accumulated human knowledge in history. The systematic destruction of cultural heritage during the Cultural Revolution in China during the 1960s and 1970s led to the loss of countless historical texts, artworks, temple records, and traditional knowledge systems. Books were burned, temples were demolished, scholars and practitioners of traditional arts and sciences were persecuted, imprisoned, or killed. The full extent of what was lost during this decade of upheaval is still being assessed, and some of it will never be fully known. The destruction of indigenous knowledge systems across the Americas, Africa, Australia, and the Pacific Islands by European colonial powers represents yet another chapter in this same devastating pattern. Across these regions, sophisticated bodies of knowledge about medicine, agriculture, ecology, navigation, astronomy, and the management of complex societies were developed independently over thousands of years. Indigenous Australian peoples accumulated detailed ecological knowledge over at least 60,000 years of continuous habitation, making their knowledge traditions the oldest continuously maintained on Earth. Polynesian navigators developed techniques for crossing thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars, ocean swells, cloud patterns, and the behavior of birds and marine life. Techniques that represent one of the most remarkable bodies of practical scientific knowledge ever developed by any culture. Native American agricultural traditions produced crop varieties and cultivation techniques adapted to every climate from the Arctic to the tropics, including the development of maize from its wild ancestor teosinte, one of the most consequential acts of genetic engineering in human history, accomplished entirely through patient selection and crossbreeding over millennia. Much of this indigenous knowledge was never written down in the forms that European colonizers recognized as legitimate record-keeping. It was stored in oral traditions, in songs, in ceremonial practices, in the accumulated expertise of specialized practitioners who transmitted their knowledge to chosen successors through years of personal mentorship. When colonial policies disrupted indigenous communities, when children were removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, where their languages and cultural practices were forbidden, when traditional leaders were killed or marginalized, the chains of transmission were broken. Knowledge that had been maintained for centuries or millennia was lost within a single generation. The scale of this loss is difficult to quantify precisely because much of the knowledge was never documented in written form, making its extent invisible to historical record-keeping systems designed around written texts. But anthropologists, linguists, and indigenous scholars who have worked to document what remains consistently report that what survives is only a fraction of what once existed. Each of these events represents the same fundamental pattern: a body of accumulated knowledge, developed over centuries or millennia by the collective effort of countless human minds, was destroyed or severely damaged in a relatively short period. And in each case, the recovery took far longer than the destruction. This asymmetry between the speed of destruction and the slowness of recovery is one of the most important and most neglected facts about human civilization. Destruction is fast. Creation is slow. It takes centuries to build a scholarly tradition, decades to train a generation of scientists, years to write a single treatise. But a library can burn in an afternoon. A city can be sacked in a week. A civilization's accumulated knowledge can be scattered to the winds in the time it takes for one army to march through one set of gates. The numbers are striking when we attempt to quantify this asymmetry. The House of Wisdom accumulated its collections over approximately 500 years of continuous effort. It was destroyed in approximately 1 week. The ratio of creation time to destruction time is roughly 26,000 to 1. 500 years of human effort, thousands of scholars' lifetimes of work, erased in 7 days. No other human activity displays such a dramatic imbalance between the effort required to build and the ease with which what has been built can be torn down. A cathedral takes a century to construct and an hour to demolish. A forest takes a millennium to mature and a day to burn. But a scholarly tradition, which depends not just on physical objects but on living networks of human minds, is even more fragile, because once the minds are gone, the objects alone cannot fully reconstruct what they contained. We tend to focus on creation. We celebrate the moments of breakthrough. We remember the names of the discoverers. We build monuments to the inventors and the pioneers. But we pay far less attention to the fragility of what has been created. We do not fully appreciate how easily the work of centuries can be undone in days, how readily the labor of thousands of minds can be erased by the decision of a single commander or the indifference of a single generation. The fragility is not merely a function of physical vulnerability. Books burn, paper dissolves, hard drives fail. But knowledge also depends on human communities, on institutions, on the living networks of teachers and students and patrons and readers that give knowledge its meaning and its momentum. A book sitting on a shelf in an empty room is not, in any functional sense, knowledge. It is potential knowledge, inert and silent until a mind engages with it, interprets it, questions it, and uses it to generate new understanding. When the community of minds that sustained a particular intellectual tradition is destroyed, the books they leave behind become, in a very real sense, partially dead. They can be read, but they can no longer be fully understood in the context that gave them their deepest significance. This is what happened after Baghdad fell. Even the texts that survived in other locations lost their full context. A mathematical treatise, written as part of an ongoing debate within a specific scholarly circle, became partially opaque when that circle no longer existed. The arguments in the treatise were responses to positions that had been articulated in other texts, texts that were now lost. The terminology used reflected conventions that had been developed in a specific community over decades, conventions that were not recorded in any surviving glossary. The insights the treatise contained were stepping stones to further insights that its author intended to develop in future works, works that were never written because the author was killed, or the resources that supported his research were destroyed. The knowledge that survived was real, but it was diminished. It was like hearing one voice in what had been a choir. The voice is beautiful and meaningful on its own, but something essential is missing. The harmony is gone. The counterpoint is silent. The full richness of the original performance can never be recovered because most of the singers are dead, and their parts were never written down. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the durability of knowledge. We assume that because something is written down, it is safe. We assume that because information is abundant, it is secure. We assume that the institutions we have built to preserve knowledge, our universities, our libraries, our digital archives, will endure. These assumptions may be correct in the short term, but the history of Baghdad, of Alexandria, of Rome, of the Maya, of every civilization that has built and then lost a great tradition of knowledge, suggests that in the long term, these assumptions are dangerously naive. We are, in a very real sense, building a civilization of unprecedented knowledge on a foundation of unprecedented fragility. The vast majority of the knowledge being produced today is stored in digital formats that require specific hardware and software to read. A clay tablet from Sumeria has survived for 5,000 years. A papyrus scroll from Egypt has survived for 3,000 years. A parchment manuscript from medieval Europe has survived for 1,000 years. How long will a hard drive last? A server? A website? A social media platform? The digital infrastructure that holds our collective knowledge is powerful and extensive, but it is also dependent on electricity, on functioning hardware, on maintained software, on economic systems that generate the revenue needed to keep data centers running. Consider the phenomenon of digital decay. Studies have shown that a significant percentage of web addresses cease to function within a few years of their creation. Scientific datasets, stored on magnetic tapes from the 1960s and 70s, are, in many cases, unreadable because the tape drives needed to access them no longer exist and cannot be manufactured. Software written for operating systems that are no longer supported cannot be run on modern hardware without emulation, and the emulators themselves require maintenance and updating. We are producing more knowledge than any civilization in history, but we may also be storing it in the most ephemeral medium that any civilization has ever used. The Internet Archive, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving digital content, has catalogued the scale of this problem with alarming clarity. A study of hyperlinks in legal documents, academic papers, and news articles found that roughly half of all URLs cited in those documents no longer function within a decade of publication. The scientific literature, which is supposed to represent the permanent record of human knowledge, is riddled with references to data, supplementary materials, and online resources that have vanished. Research papers that depended on specific datasets may become partially or wholly unreproducible when those datasets disappear from their original servers. The reproducibility crisis in modern science, much discussed in recent years, is compounded by the impermanence of the digital infrastructure on which scientific data increasingly depends. The problem is not merely technical, it is economic and institutional. Maintaining digital archives requires ongoing investment. Servers must be powered, cooled, and replaced as hardware ages. Software must be updated to remain compatible with evolving operating systems and file formats. Staff must be hired and trained to manage collections and respond to access requests. Unlike a clay tablet, which sits unchanged in a museum drawer for centuries, a digital file requires active, continuous, and expensive maintenance to remain accessible. If the organization that maintains an archive loses its funding, or if the economic system that supports that organization collapses, or if political priorities shift away from preservation, the archive dies. Not slowly, as a papyrus scroll degrades over centuries, but quickly, as servers are shut down and domain names expire and the data they held becomes inaccessible within months or weeks. The largest digital collections in the world today, the databases maintained by companies like Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft, contain more information than all the libraries of the ancient and medieval world combined by many orders of magnitude. But these collections exist at the pleasure of corporate entities whose primary obligation is to their shareholders, not to the preservation of human knowledge. A corporation that decides a particular database is no longer profitable can delete it. A company that goes bankrupt can lose its servers in the liquidation process. A government that decides that certain types of digital content are politically undesirable can order it removed. The legal, economic, and political frameworks that govern digital information are still in their infancy, and they provide far less protection for digital knowledge than even the most modest medieval library patron provided for his manuscripts. The libraries of Baghdad were destroyed by an army. The libraries of the 21st century could be destroyed by something far less dramatic: a prolonged economic downturn that defunds preservation efforts, a shift in political priorities that reduces support for archives and libraries, a technological transition that renders current storage formats obsolete, or simply the gradual accumulation of small neglects that, over decades, erode the infrastructure on which digital preservation depends. The Tigris ran black with ink in 1258. That image has persisted in the historical memory for nearly 800 years. It persists because it is vivid, because it is specific, because it makes visible what is usually invisible, the physical substance of knowledge being destroyed. But the losses that are happening today, the slow erosion of digital archives, the quiet disappearance of web pages and datasets and software, these losses are invisible. They do not stain any river. They do not produce any dramatic image. They simply happen, silently and continuously, and by the time we notice what is gone, it may be too late to recover it. There is one more dimension of this deeper truth that deserves careful attention. It concerns not the quantity of lost knowledge, but its character. Not how many books were destroyed, but what kind of thinking they represented. The scholars of the House of Wisdom practiced something that was, in the context of their era, genuinely revolutionary. They systematically translated, compared, and synthesized intellectual traditions from multiple civilizations that had previously existed in mutual isolation. They took Greek logic and Indian arithmetic and Persian astronomical observation and Babylonian mathematical tradition and Arabic linguistic analysis and combined them, deliberately and systematically, into a new intellectual framework that was more powerful and more comprehensive than any of its component parts. This was not merely collecting. This was integrating. It was the creation of a genuinely universal approach to knowledge, one that valued truth regardless of its cultural origin, and that sought to build a complete understanding of the natural world by drawing on every available source of insight. This integrative, cross-cultural method of intellectual work is often described as one of the great achievements of Islamic civilization, and rightly so. It is, in many important ways, the direct ancestor of the modern scientific ideal. The idea that knowledge is universal, that a mathematical proof is valid regardless of who wrote it, that an empirical observation is meaningful regardless of the observer's religion or nationality, that the pursuit of truth transcends the boundaries of culture and tradition. When the House of Wisdom was destroyed, we lost not just specific texts and specific discoveries. We lost the most successful and most fully realized model of how different intellectual traditions can be brought together to produce something greater than any one tradition could achieve alone. The loss of that model, that way of thinking about the relationship between diverse traditions and universal knowledge, may have been as consequential as the loss of any individual manuscript, because a manuscript can in principle be rewritten. But a living tradition of cross-cultural intellectual synthesis, once destroyed, must be reinvented from scratch, and the reinvention may take centuries. This is the deeper truth. The destruction of Baghdad was not merely the burning of books. It was the severing of an intellectual tradition that had been, for 5 centuries, the primary engine of human scientific and philosophical progress. It was the interruption of a conversation between civilizations that had been producing extraordinary results. And the silence that followed that interruption lasted for generations, casting a shadow over the history of human knowledge that we are still, 800 years later, living within. Where does this leave us? What does the story of the House of Wisdom mean for how we understand ourselves, our civilization, and the knowledge we hold in our hands and in our institutions? The first implication is humility. Deep, genuine, uncomfortable humility. We tend to think of ourselves as the most knowledgeable generation that has ever lived. In terms of the total volume of recorded information, that claim is probably accurate. We have more data, more publications, more research output, more digitized text than any previous civilization could have imagined. But the story of Baghdad teaches us that total accumulation is not the same as security. A civilization can possess enormous knowledge and lose it in a matter of days. The quantity of what we know does not protect us from the fragility of how we store it, how we transmit it, and how we maintain the institutions that give it meaning. There is a particular kind of arrogance in the modern world that assumes our knowledge is permanent simply because it is vast. We look at our digital archives, our university libraries, our research databases, our cloud storage systems, and we feel a sense of security that may or may not be justified. But the scholars of Baghdad also felt secure. Their libraries were the largest in the world. Their institutions were the most advanced. Their city was the capital of an empire that had endured for 5 centuries. Their scholarly tradition had no rival anywhere on earth, and it was all swept away in a week. Every manuscript, every instrument, every institutional record, every chain of scholarly transmission, gone. If they were not safe, what makes us certain that we are? The second implication is grief. Not the sharp, sudden grief of a recent loss, but the slow, deep, abiding grief that comes from contemplating a wound that can never fully heal. The story of the House of Wisdom is, at its core, a story of loss so vast and so irrecoverable that it defies complete comprehension. We are not merely mourning books. We are not merely mourning buildings. We are mourning the thoughts of human beings who spent their lives trying to understand the world, and who left behind written records of what they discovered, records that were then destroyed. Each lost manuscript represents an act of human consciousness that has been permanently erased. A scholar in 9th century Baghdad sat at a desk, perhaps near a window overlooking the Tigris, dipped a reed pen into a pot of ink, and wrote down a thought. That thought might have been a mathematical proof that resolved a problem he had been working on for years. It might have been a medical observation drawn from a lifetime of clinical practice. It might have been a philosophical argument about the nature of truth or the relationship between reason and revelation. Whatever it was the product of a human mind engaging with the world, trying to make sense of what it perceived and understood. When the manuscript was destroyed, the thought was destroyed with it, not merely delayed or misplaced, destroyed, permanently removed from the sum of human knowledge. We cannot mourn each thought individually because we do not know what they were. The specific contents of most lost manuscripts are unknown and unknowable, but we can mourn the aggregate. We can acknowledge, with full seriousness, that hundreds of thousands of unique acts of human thinking, unique products of human consciousness, were erased from the world in a single week in February of 1258. And we can recognize that this erasure diminished not only the Islamic world, not only the people who lived and died in Baghdad during the siege, but all of humanity, because knowledge, once created, belongs to the whole species. A mathematical proof discovered in Baghdad in the 10th century is as much a part of the human intellectual heritage as a theorem proven in Athens or a formula derived in London. When it is lost, the loss is universal, even if it is felt most acutely by those closest to the tradition from which it came. There is a tendency in popular discourse to treat the House of Wisdom as a curiosity of Islamic history, a remarkable but ultimately regional phenomenon. This framing is profoundly misleading. The House of Wisdom was not a regional institution. It was a global one, in the sense that it drew upon the intellectual traditions of every major civilization in the known world and produced knowledge that eventually influenced every civilization that came after it. The algebra that students learn in high schools around the world today traces its origins to Al-Khwarizmi's work in Baghdad. The algorithms that power the digital technologies upon which the modern economy depends take their name from his. The optical principles that underlie cameras, telescopes, microscopes, and eyeglasses were first correctly described by Ibn al-Haytham in Cairo, building on a tradition that was rooted in the scholarly culture of the House of Wisdom. The medical knowledge that formed the basis of European medical education for 5 centuries was compiled and systematized by Ibn Sina, working within the same tradition. The destruction of the House of Wisdom was not a loss for the Islamic world alone. It was a loss for every human being who has ever benefited from the advancement of scientific knowledge, which is to say, every human being who has ever lived since 1258. The third implication is responsibility. If the story of Baghdad teaches us anything with absolute clarity, it teaches us that the preservation of knowledge is not automatic. It does not happen by itself. It requires deliberate effort, sustained investment, careful planning, and constant vigilance. Knowledge does not preserve itself. Books rot if they are not stored properly. Hard drives fail if they are not backed up. Institutions decay if they are not funded and maintained. Languages die if they are not spoken and taught. The only thing that keeps knowledge alive is the active, ongoing, never completed commitment of living human beings to maintain it, copy it, translate it, contextualize it, teach it, and pass it on to the next generation. This responsibility is not abstract. It is concrete and it is immediate. Every library that is underfunded, every archive that is neglected, every indigenous language that dies without being recorded, every traditional craft or agricultural practice that is lost because no young person learned it, every scientific dataset that becomes inaccessible because the format it was stored in is no longer supported. Each of these is a small echo of the catastrophe of Baghdad. None of them, individually, compares in scale to the destruction of the House of Wisdom, but collectively, spread across decades and centuries, they represent a pattern of slow, quiet, invisible loss that mirrors, in its aggregate effect, the dramatic destructions that history records with such horror. The linguist who documents the last speakers of a dying language is doing the same work that Hunayn ibn Ishaq did when he translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserving a tradition of human thought before the last voices that carry it fall silent. The archivist who migrates data from obsolete formats to current ones is performing the same function as the medieval scribe who copied a deteriorating manuscript onto fresh parchment, keeping knowledge alive across a technological transition. The teacher who passes specialized knowledge to the next generation of students is maintaining the same chain of transmission that connected the scholars of the House of Wisdom across centuries. The living bond between minds that no book, however comprehensive, can fully replace. These acts of preservation are not glamorous. They do not generate headlines. They do not produce dramatic images. But they are, in the deepest and most consequential sense, the essential work of civilization. Without them, everything else we build is temporary. The ruins of great libraries haunt the imagination precisely because they remind us of what we prefer to forget. That the arc of human knowledge does not always bend upward. Sometimes it bends downward, sharply and irreversibly, and the brilliant minds who built what was lost cannot come back to rebuild it. We stand today amid the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human effort, and we are right to feel a sense of wonder at what has been achieved. But wonder alone is not enough. Wonder must be accompanied by vigilance, by a clear-eyed recognition that what has been achieved can be lost, and that the forces of destruction, whether they take the form of armies, of neglect, of economic collapse, or of technological obsolescence, are always present and always active. The House of Wisdom burned because no one with the power to protect it made the choice to do so. The knowledge inside it was priceless, irreplaceable, and utterly defenseless against the forces of destruction. Let us not make the same mistake with the knowledge we hold in our own hands and in our own fragile institutions. There is a pause that is worth taking here, a moment of stillness in the flow of facts and arguments. Consider the knowledge that you yourself possess, the things you have learned through years of study, through decades of experience, through conversations with teachers and mentors and colleagues. How much of that knowledge is recorded anywhere outside your own mind? How much of it exists only in your memory, in the patterns of your thinking, in the intuitions and judgments you have developed over a lifetime? And what happens to all of that when you are gone? Every human being is, in a small but real way, a library. We each carry knowledge that no one else on earth possesses in exactly the same form. Memories, observations, insights, connections between ideas, skills learned through practice, understanding shaped by experience. Most of this personal knowledge is never written down. It is never formally transmitted. It passes out of the world when we do. This is the most fundamental form of knowledge loss, the one that occurs continuously and invisibly, in every culture, in every generation, billions of times over in the course of human history. The destruction of Baghdad was a dramatic, concentrated, historically documented version of something that happens silently and without record every single day. The scholars of the House of Wisdom understood this. They dedicated their lives to the project of fighting against the natural decay of knowledge. They translated texts from dying languages into a living one. They copied fragile manuscripts onto fresh paper. They organized, catalogued, and preserved the intellectual inheritance of civilizations that had fallen and would otherwise have been forgotten. They built an institution whose explicit purpose was to hold knowledge safe against the erosions of time and forgetfulness, and they succeeded magnificently for 500 years. Then destruction came, and 500 years of effort was undone in a week. The lesson is not that their effort was wasted. Their effort was noble and necessary and produced incalculable benefits for all of humanity. The lesson is that preservation requires not just effort but protection. Knowledge must not only be recorded and maintained, it must also be defended, dispersed, duplicated, and distributed widely enough that no single catastrophe can erase it all. The Abbasid scholars knew this in principle. They sent copies of their most important works to libraries in Cordoba, Cairo, Damascus, and other cities. But the concentration of originals, of unique manuscripts, of irreplaceable research in Baghdad was so enormous that even their efforts at distribution could not save more than a fraction of what existed. The lesson for our own age is clear. Redundancy is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Backup is not a technical nicety, it is a civilizational imperative. The knowledge we create must be stored in multiple formats, in multiple locations, maintained by multiple institutions, accessible through multiple technologies. Anything less is a gamble against history, and history, as Baghdad demonstrates, does not always lose. The Tigris River still flows through Baghdad. It has flowed through that city for more than 12.5 centuries. It carried the boats of merchants and the barges of caliphs. It watered the gardens of palaces and the fields of farmers. It reflected the minarets of mosques and the walls of libraries. And on one terrible week in February of 1258, it carried the dissolved remains of humanity's greatest collection of knowledge into the Persian Gulf and out to sea. The ink is gone now. The words are gone. The paper that held them has returned to the elements from which it was made. Cellulose fibers, broken apart by water, dispersed by current. Carbon particles, suspended briefly in solution, then settled into the silt of the riverbed or carried to the ocean. The physical substance of hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, the material that bore the weight of 5 centuries of human inquiry, has been absorbed into the vast and indifferent body of the sea. No trace remains, no fragment persists. The river cleared, the water became clean again, and the world moved on, diminished in ways that most people never knew and still do not fully understand. But the absence remains. The absence is a presence of its own, as real and as consequential as anything that survives. It is a silence in the historical record where there should be voices, a blankness on the shelf where volumes should stand, a gap in the chain of knowledge where links should connect past discovery to future insight. It is the space where a mathematical proof should be, the empty page where a medical observation should be recorded, the missing chapter in the long and unfinished story of how human beings learned to understand the world they inhabit. We do not know what was written on those pages. We will never know. That is the deepest wound, the one that does not heal with time. Not the loss itself, terrible as it is, but the impossibility of ever fully understanding the scope and nature of the loss. We mourn what we know we have lost. The texts we can name, the scholars we can identify, the discoveries we can trace through references in surviving works. But behind those known losses lies a vastness of unknown loss, a realm of vanished thought that is, by its very nature, beyond our ability to measure, describe, or even fully imagine. We know that the void is there. We can estimate its approximate dimensions, but we cannot see into it. We cannot recover what it holds. We can only stand at its edge and acknowledge, with whatever humility we can manage, that something of incalculable value once occupied that space and is now gone forever. The House of Wisdom stood for 5 centuries. It was destroyed in 7 days. 5 centuries of human effort, of scholarship, of patient and painstaking accumulation, unmade in less than a week. The ratio is itself a lesson. It speaks to the fundamental asymmetry between creation and destruction that runs through all of human history. It takes a lifetime to train a scholar. It takes a generation to build a scholarly tradition. It takes centuries to accumulate a library. And it takes a single fire, a single flood, a single week of violence to reduce all of it to nothing. The destruction was not carried out by people who hated knowledge. The Mongols were not barbarians in the simple sense that the word is sometimes used. They were skilled administrators, capable generals, and, in many cases, curious and pragmatic rulers. Hulagu Khan himself, the man who ordered the sack of Baghdad, later became a patron of astronomical research. He funded the construction of the Maraga Observatory and employed some of the finest scientific minds of his age. The destruction of Baghdad's libraries was not an act of anti-intellectual ideology. It was an act of military routine, a standard component of the sack of a conquered city. The books were not feared, they were not targeted, they were simply not valued in the moment of conquest. They were in the way, they were collateral damage, and that is perhaps the most frightening lesson of all, because indifference is not a rare quality. It is not confined to 13th century Mongol armies. It exists in every era, in every culture, in every generation. It is the force that allows libraries to be quietly defunded and slowly emptied. It is the force that lets archives crumble in damp basements, while attention and resources flow to more urgent or more fashionable concerns. It is the force that permits languages to die, and traditions to fade and knowledge to slip away, not because anyone decided to destroy it, but because no one decided to save it. Indifference does not destroy with malice. It destroys by omission, and the results are the same. The river ran black. That image has survived for nearly 800 years. It survives because it captures, in a single vivid detail, the essence of what happened. The blackness of the water was the visible sign of an invisible catastrophe. Knowledge itself is invisible. It has no color, no weight, no physical form, apart from the medium that carries it. It exists as patterns of meaning encoded in symbols written on surfaces. You cannot touch it. You cannot see it directly. You can only see its medium. The page, the scroll, the screen, the stone. When the medium is destroyed, the knowledge becomes briefly visible as it dies. The ink dissolves. The page darkens the water, and for a moment, just a moment, you can see the physical trace of what is being lost. Then the current carries it away. The water clears, and the knowledge is gone as if it had never been. What the House of Wisdom represented was not merely a collection of manuscripts or a community of scholars, as important as those were. It represented a possibility. The possibility that human beings, through sustained and collective effort, could build a comprehensive understanding of the natural world that transcended the limitations of any single culture or tradition. The possibility that Greek and Indian and Persian and Arabic and Chinese insights could be woven together into a single, coherent, ever-growing tapestry of understanding. The possibility that knowledge, once created, could be preserved against time and loss and passed intact from one generation to the next, growing richer and more complete with each transfer. That possibility was not destroyed forever. It re-emerged, centuries later, in different forms and different places. The European scientific revolution, the global scientific enterprise of the modern age, the international networks of research and publication and peer review that span the world today. These are all, in their own ways, descendants of the same impulse that animated the House of Wisdom, the impulse to understand, the impulse to record what is understood, the impulse to share knowledge across the boundaries of culture and language and geography, the impulse to build, generation upon generation, a cumulative understanding of the world. But the interruption mattered, the centuries of delay mattered, the lost manuscripts mattered, the broken chains of transmission mattered. The scholars who were killed and the students who were never taught mattered. The observations that were never passed on and the discoveries that were never built upon mattered. The medical treatments that might have been developed and the technologies that might have been created, and the questions that might have been answered if those 5 centuries of accumulated knowledge had not been thrown into a river. All of it mattered. And the consequences of the loss are woven into the fabric of the world we live in today. Invisible but real, like the ink that stained the Tigris for a few dark days, and then disappeared into the indifference of the sea. The final thought is the simplest one, and perhaps the most important. Knowledge is not a permanent acquisition. It is a flame that must be constantly tended. It can be passed from candle to candle, from mind to mind, from page to page, from generation to generation, growing brighter and warmer with each successful transfer. But it can also be extinguished, and once extinguished, it cannot be relit from the same source. A new flame may be kindled, but it will not be the same flame. The light it casts will fall from a different angle. The shadows it creates will have a different shape. The warmth it provides will be the warmth of a new fire, not the old one. What the old fire illuminated in its unique way will remain in darkness forever. The flame that burned in the House of Wisdom was one of the brightest that human civilization has ever kindled. Its light illuminated the world for 500 years. It cast its warmth across continents, and when it was extinguished, in February of 1258, the darkness that followed was not merely the absence of that particular light. It was the absence of everything that light would have revealed, everything it would have warmed, everything it would have made visible had it been allowed to continue burning. The Tigris still flows, the ink is gone, and we are still, 8 centuries later, trying to read by a dimmer flame.